Really?
Yeah. No, ordinance zone documentary, when they have this audio recording of
See how
two
she
of
can
the
organize
American
and she can put
right
patterns and things
politicians,
together.
politicians,
Yeah,
actual actors.
okay. I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome and good morning to everybody. As usual, it's good to see everybody. Today, of course, we're going to continue reading the introduction to Hegel's Science of Logic, but we have to also begin by discussing the war in the Ukraine. I don't intend to go through the details of it. I think we did a good part of that last week, and I'm certain that everybody here receives, if nothing else, Jeremiah's posts on Facebook, which keeps us all quite informed. And it's not, and really, it's not that complicated if you understand the essence of world events at this time. And frankly, if you have what Hegel is developing, a dialectical way of understanding the movement of events, the movement of phenomenon, and frankly, how objective logics determine, we might even use the word over-determine, subjective logics. In other words, world movements create the frameworks out of which and through which individual actors behave. We'll come back to that in a minute. I guess to make sense of a lot of this, we could turn to Clausewitz, who we've talked about so much here. Clausewitz, who is the German 19th century historian and theorist of war, said that war is politics by other means. So if we understand what he's getting at, we can better understand the political nature of what's going on in Ukraine, Western Europe, Russia, and of course the world. And that's what I want to focus upon. But the concept politics, as used by people like Clausewitz, does not mean electoral politics. It means politics as a struggle of ideas. And that's fundamentally what politics is. And of course, here we go again, it's not the liberal Anglo-American idea. It is this larger, holistic, dialectically connected sense of politics. It is politics as the profound movement of groups and individuals. And at the end of the day, what Marx and those called the class conflict. That's what they mean by politics. It has been degraded, as most things have been, through the Anglo-American philosophical prism. And of course in America through American pragmatism. But in its most generic sense, even in Aristotle, politics is this great struggle of ideas. In a lot of ways for Aristotle, it was this moral struggle, the struggle for right and wrong, good and evil, things like that. But at any rate, when Clausewitz said that war is politics by other means, and I guess I would underline, by other means, which means that there are multiple means of conducting politics, and war is one of them. The other thing is that diplomacy, just to extend his formulation, diplomacy is politics by other means. So, we saw leading up to the war in Ukraine, the possibilities of diplomacy. But it was clear that the Biden administration, the US side, did not wish to conduct politics by diplomacy. They actually wanted a war to achieve other political objectives. Okay? And they literally are prepared to sacrifice Ukraine to this bigger political program, which is, and this is the Biden administration, and as we in the free school were so engaged in the 2020 election, the 2016 election, not that we were out there, campaigning, but in explaining what was going on. And it was very, very clear that the ruling class, who are more united today than I don't think they've ever been this united. And the Biden administration is the instrument of the ruling class's overall program. That doesn't mean that every billionaire is with Biden. It does not mean that every general is with Biden. When we say unity, we don't mean absolute unity. We mean unity relative to what it has been in other periods. They were not this united during the war in Vietnam. Perhaps they were close to being this united in World War II. Perhaps. But they are very united, and they are united around the project of reestablishing the ideological and political and military hegemony of the United States. And so war in Ukraine was part of this bigger objective. In other words, a higher political objective than just Ukraine or Ukraine being in NATO. And that was, one, to reunite a divided and fractured Europe, to reunite Europe behind the hegemony of the United States, to restore NATO as an offensive military organization, and politically to subdue Russia. I mean, there's probably more going on as well, but I just want to suggest that the Biden administration wanted this war for these geostrategic reasons that I've mentioned. I should also say for domestic political reasons, shift the discourse from inflation, COVID, violence in the cities, and whatever else has brought their polling numbers down to the 30s. In other words, close to 60% of the American public do not support the Biden administration. Just a parenthetical thing, that's never happened. Where within 1 year, an administration, in terms of polling numbers, collapses so quickly. This is unprecedented, especially when one considers that Biden got more votes than any candidate running for president in the history of the United States. That the whole campaign, which itself is not very well understood, was not just the Democratic Party. They tried that in 2016 and lost with the Clinton organization, the most powerful political organization in the country, I think even up to this point. So they needed a social uprising, and this is inverted quotes, called the Black Lives Matter movement, to make it look like that Biden was the candidate of a mass movement. In a certain way, he was going to outdo Franklin D. Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson. Franklin Roosevelt associated with the labor movement and the New Deal, and so he was a president not only of a political party, but of a movement. Lyndon Johnson became identified with the civil rights movement. You know, I recall, I think it was 1964, maybe 65, when Lyndon Johnson went to Howard University and in the speech said, "And yes, we shall overcome." I mean, that was like, oh my God, a president speaking at a historically black college and then say, "We shall," I mean, it was, you know, it was complete theater.
Right.
And so on. But nonetheless, he did it. So Biden's people, the ruling class, said, well, you know, first of all, we're not going to beat Trump just with the Democratic Party organization and with all of the funders and so on of the Democratic Party. We can't beat him on those terms. Therefore, we need a movement. And thus it was the Black Lives Matter movement, proclaimed by the New York Times to be the greatest and largest civil rights movement in history. And I guess if you saw the numbers, and if you wanted to call it a civil rights movement, it was. They said 15 to 25 million people participated in a Black Lives Matter demonstration. So if that's the measure, because most, if you go back to the real civil rights movement, most of what they did was a few people going in to the rural South and organizing people, living with the people. Not what we saw with this, what I call it a charade. And anybody that knows anything about social movements, you ask certain questions. Well, who is behind this? Who are the organizers? You couldn't identify organizers. Then the next question is, well, who's paying for this? Well, we're not going to tell you. That's, you know, top secret. But you see, you get my point. But they come to power, and it seems like they will be a progressive administration. We want, what it is, I guess the first Build Back Better bill was supposed to be $3.5 trillion.
Oh, did we get that?
Huh?
Did we get that? Or no?
No, they see, this is the whole thing. He didn't get that. But in not getting it, and there were differences. There were different based upon economic policy. You know, an economy that was not in recession, the economy by 2021 had come out of the recession or the depression of 2020. It had come out of that. So there's always a problem. If you put too much money in the economy, it overheats. The word inflation itself generically means to inflate the money supply. So you have more money than goods. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
And so everything goes up. But that, that's the generic definition. But then there are many other factors, and that's those are economic questions, empirical questions. But in its origin, what sets it off is inflating the money supply. And between the start of COVID in 2020 and Trump's first and second, I think Trump had 3 major bills. Did people ever realize that you didn't have to go to work anymore and you were still getting paid? Yeah, that had several effects. I mean, to prevent the economy from going into a deeper depression, and also to keep people from rebelling. If you're hungry, you are going to rise up. So, and then Biden comes in, and they passed the infrastructure bill. Everything is in the trillions now. Everything is in the trillions. Which is extraordinary. But then he was trying to get this $3.5 trillion bill on top of the 1.9 trillion. So many trillions, you forget about when these bills were passed. But all of that, along with other things, set off the steepest inflation that the nation has ever seen. And then the promise of having, dealing with COVID, and we're going to get rid of this, and we can take off our masks, we can get back to normal, and yada yada. That didn't happen. And then the growing dissatisfaction of the majority of U.S. citizens at the rise of violence, the rise of despair, etc. A dissatisfaction generally with the society. And Biden is politically inept. Maybe at a younger period in his life he may have been more capable, but right now the brain cells are leaving him too fast. The guy is out of it, And see, I just happened to have been alive when the guy was at his height. He was arrogant, he was a narcissist, he'd cuss you out with the quickness, drank all the hard whiskey he could get his hands on, and so on. But now he's just like, and he can't handle it. So there's not a vital leadership to bring together the vital center, as they call it. So the war in Ukraine, and quote, standing up to Putin, and this being Biden's John Kennedy moment. See, this is, it's one of those situations where the ruling class is unable to think. And they believe their own propaganda. And this is what we're seeing. So you have these neocons, which means people who conduct foreign policy based upon ideology. Now, nobody is ever bases foreign policy in a way that excludes ideology, but their ideological agenda, and that's what Blinken and Jake Sullivan are. We'll talk about that later. And so they always had an animus, a dislike for, and a desire to put Russia in its place, not to see it grow. And so this war is, I would say, Biden's war, but it is a war for all of the political reasons I think that we have discussed here for many weeks, Russia could not back away from it. It is a war they didn't want, but it was a war they were forced into. To put it another way, I don't think they had other political options. I don't think so.
Wow.
I compare it in some ways to India and in the war of East Pakistan of 1971. India couldn't get back out of it. They didn't want the war. They would have hoped that West Pakistan could have come to terms diplomatically and peacefully with East Pakistan, but the West Pakistanis brought their army in to suppress the people who were just asking for basic democratic rights and to be equal with the West Pakistan. And this was a similar type of war. But you couldn't solve the problem of the Donbass, which is the East, the Russian-speaking, without addressing the larger problem of what Ukraine had become, what the ruling class of Ukraine is, and how the United States in particular were using the ruling class of Ukraine as a stick to beat Russia back into its place or to beat it down. That was, and, I would, just the last thing, the ruling class of the United States is delusional. And it always happens, I guess, when a ruling class is in a crisis of its own existence. It questions, whether it still has it like it used to. In other words, the bully, who was used to pushing people around and, telling you, go to the store for me and get me a Coca-Cola and bring it back. Bullies. Or punching people just to punch them and that type of thing. Well, at some point the bully ages. But the bully has that thing, I want to prove that I'm still what I used to be. And so the bully believes his own hype, his own narrative, his own fantasies. And so the bully tests whether or not he still has it and then runs up on somebody that knocks him out. This is what has happened with the United States. They underestimated Putin, they underestimated Russia, its economy, its military, and it underestimated or tried to dismiss Russia's claims that NATO is an existential threat to us. And you're building these missile infrastructures. You're saying these are defensive nuclear weapons in Poland and Romania, but all you have to do is change the software, and they're offensive, that you could hit the Kremlin, the seat of power in Russia. You could hit them in a matter of minutes, 7 minutes, and if you make them hypersonic cruise missiles, you can do it in 4 or 5 minutes, not enough time to respond. If you hit the Kremlin, you could wipe out the entire leadership of Russia in a matter of minutes without their being able to respond. And once you decapitate a nation, well, we saw what happened with Gorbachev in those. Once you do that, a nation goes into decline and chaos and confusion. And they said, you have to back up. And Europe must adopt a new security architecture where the security of Ukraine cannot be at the expense of Russia, or vice versa. Or the security of Western Europe cannot be at the expense of Russia. That's all they were saying. And Blinken and them tried to, when they presented a proposal, I think in January, a very coherent proposal based on international law and the Helsinki agreements of 1975. You all look it up. I don't feel like going into that right now. Mutual security in Europe, which kind of diffused the initial Cold War, that no side would try to get military advantage over the other. Well, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that's all the West and the United States tried to do, get military advantage. And that contradiction was waiting to be resolved. It was unsustainable. At some point, Russia would not continue to be weak without unified leadership and with a broken military. It wouldn't last forever. And so the moment of truth came in 2022. Without going into more details, and maybe Jeremiah can go into more detail, but if we take Hegel's science of logic, and when we get into it, you'll see where one of the laws of dialectics is quantitative changes eventually becoming qualitative changes. That a thing changes within the framework of its current existence, but those changes ultimately lead to a new quality, a new phenomenon. You know what I'm saying? Something new comes out of the old. This is kind of what we're looking at now. The end of the unipolar world system with a single hegemon. Hegemon meaning, what is hegemon? How would you define it? Hegemon, one dominant center. Hegemony, dominance. I think that's a good way to say it. The unipolar world, which begins with the collapse of the Soviet Union and continued for 30 years practically, has suddenly ended. But it was not just sudden. Mm-hmm. It was an evolving situation. Mm-hmm. And it involved not just Russia, but China, India. Very interesting, the Indian positionality. It involved, because this is what we talk about, the intersecting dialectics. Mm-hmm. It's not just one dialectical thing, because then you're dealing with the anti-war sentiment among the American people. And this is just my own evaluation. The US people have never been so anti-war as they are now. Does that mean that they're marching in the streets and the war in Vietnam? No. It's not taking that form. But the American people are war exhausted. They don't trust the national politicians because they feel, and they're right, that they lied to them about war. Mm-hmm. It's obvious that Colin Powell went to the UN saying, weapons of mass destruction, I have this vial of chemicals, and then come to find out it was just baking soda or something, And it was a big lie. The big lie for the war in Libya, the big lie for the war in Afghanistan, just lie upon lie, and trillions upon trillions of dollars spent on these wars.
Yeah, that's true.
The American people, and see, this is why they have to keep this thing going, that the masses of people, especially white people, are terrorists and white supremacists. You have to smear them so their legitimate desire for peace, which can be built upon. You know what I'm saying? That's not the end of it, but it's a beginning. It's a fundamental foundation to build a political program that is the opposite of war, that calls for, defunding the military, defund the police, defund the Pentagon. You see what I'm saying? The American people are prepared for that, etc. That contradiction between the democratic aspirations of the masses and the imperial aspirations of the ruling elite, that is a hell of a contradiction. That has to be included in any explanation of this moment. The Biden administration pushing for war, prepared to sacrifice Ukraine. They could care less than a damn about Ukraine. And the American people, not to mention the European people that don't want any war in Europe, but the American people who are not interested in war, don't believe the war makers, and frankly, don't believe too much that Biden has to say anyway. That has to be factored in. Then the rise of China, challenging the unipolar world. But China brings to the table something that Russia does not bring, the possibility of challenging dollar hegemony in world trade. China brings a very developed technology and, I have to say, a new democracy, a new paradigm for the organization of the state and government. All of this conspires to bring about the dramatic end of the unipolar world and the beginning of the multipolar world. Now, what do we mean by multipolarity? I don't know. It is still coming into being, but it's the opposite of unipolar, one hegemon. It certainly new alliances. Of course, the Russia-China alliance. Two of the three nuclear superpowers are united against the other one. So the whole thing of nuclear blackmail, and you guys probably never heard of that word, but when the U.S. generals, for example, would threaten Cuba with nuclear annihilation, when in Vietnam, and I've said this a couple of times, we heard it so much, and in Korea, I mean, it was just, they would say things, we will bomb you back into the Stone Age, And that's when Mao Zedong came forward with a response. He said, yeah, well, do it, and you will be wiped out, but there'll still be 3 million of us left, and we will rebuild from there. I don't think he meant it literally, but he's saying don't try to bully us because you have nuclear weapons, and that's what they did until they could not do it any longer. that part of the Cold War you guys don't understand. And, you know, the way they parade out these people as though they were great statesmen, but they were nothing. Curtis LeMay, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and of the Air Force, threatening to blow Cuba off the face of the earth. They damn near completely, or attempted, I should say, to wipe out the North Koreans. I don't think any Korean living that has any pride should forget that. I know you got a lot of Uncle Toms running things over there. You understand? Now, I sound like Brandon Doe. But who would find it easier to collaborate with those who would wipe their own people out than to find unity with their sisters and brothers in the North. That whole Korean thing, I hope we explore it very deeply at the conference that's coming up. It's very, very important. And it's a test of the memory, historic memory of the South Korean people. Whether or not their memory is strong enough to overcome the propaganda that reduces the great people to nothing, to just slaves and toadies of a white regime. But anyway, I won't go any further. But this new moment, I'll put this way, a new qualitative moment in world history. And, you know, I'm always talking about I want to take a victory lap. I've been taking a couple these days. I mean, so much so that I'll be doing an interview on Black Agenda Report tomorrow.
Okay.
And I feel, if there are any of them listening, I feel y'all canceled me. And that's okay. I mean, you weren't, I was canceled across the board, so much so that I had to chill on telling people how I voted in 2020.
Right.
But at any rate, the Biden administration it could only do what it has done. It could only do what it has done. Its position is that weak. It's that weak. And they have to reconsolidate, finding a way, as he puts it, to build back better. But the other side of this, and I think this I'll end here. Remember, we always talked about the crisis of legitimacy. Lenin formulated the same thing. When the ruling class cannot rule, he said in the old way, I'll just say, cannot rule. When the possibilities of reform, not just of the economic system, but of the state system, the system of rule, when they can't reform it without losing power. It's almost, analogically, it is the Russian Romanovs in 1917. You can't reform the rule, the old form of rule, the czarist dynastic form of rule, and you're therefore forced to give up, to give in. You're forced to give up and to give in. How y'all doing? Nice to see you, Tara. Or the Qing Dynasty, Qing Dynasty, Qing Dynasty, the Qing Dynasty. Well, they don't just abandon power because they want to go on vacation. They abandon power because they cannot rule, and the form of rule can't be reformed. This is why this crisis in the U.S. ruling class, and to understand the crisis, pretty much just listen to them. Mm-hmm. Just listen, and they kind of reveal the crisis by what they say and the way they say it. I was listening to Hillary Clinton the other day. Of course, it's not a pleasant thing. She's not a pleasant person. I've been around long enough to see her age. God. I mean, as a young woman, she was cute. I give her that. But now, she would. I mean, y'all can't see it, but look at some of her older pictures when Chelsea was a little baby. I mean, I'm not, the woman had, okay.
You mean politically?
Okay. Maybe I'm not the best judge of these matters, but you look at her today.
No, she was.
The woman looks like a monster.
She does. Damn.
She really looks bad, but that's a manifestation of a deep internal crisis. So I'm listening to her interview about the Ukraine, and of course, the Democrats want to run her for president. That is another sign of a ruling class unable to rule.
That's crazy.
And as crazy as it sounds, they might try to run AOC.
Really?
Oh, boy.
Yeah, I'm just saying. It's just that bad.
Wow.
They can't run Biden again, I don't think.
No.
Kamala is broadly disliked and unknown, and it caught in the throes of a internal struggle within the White House.
That's true.
It's real. I wouldn't want to be her for anything. Like you say, party girl, but I can't party my way out of this one. I'm not hating.
Yeah.
But that's part of the biography. I partied like it's 1999. But Hillary, and so she starts out relatively calm, professional.
Mm-hmm.
So they go away for a commercial. We'd be right back. When they came back,
Oh shit.
girlfriend had lost all. She was almost hysterical.
Really?
Democracy and our democracy and world democracy and the
Ew.
autocrats and the terrorists of January 6th and all these white people, they fucking with us and talking about their own white people. She just went crazy. And I said to myself, this is the crisis. Where they don't have a narrative that they can sell to the people. The people do not believe them.
I haven't seen him in a minute. Really? Damn. Coming out of nowhere.
Yeah, we went to Lincoln. This is one of my other Lincoln comrades. Hey, you sir. So I just wanted, I'll kind of end on this and then
Damn.
I think from the domestic standpoint, if you look at the foreign policy, at least Ukraine, and you look at it through the lens of the crisis of rule in the United States, you can begin to understand the politics or the political war as politics by other means. I'll just end here.
I'm gonna add one point.
The end of the unipolar moment, a 30-year period. Not an epoch, but an era. The possibility of a intensifying struggle for power within the United States. First within the ruling class, but I think spreading throughout the society. I think this will occasion a new stage. I've often talked of the fifth stage of the general crisis of imperialism, from 1913 to 2022. A new stage of a general crisis, which is both economic, political, military, ideological. A crisis of the dollar and dollar hegemony. A challenge for the first time in 75 years, a challenge to the domination or the dominance of the dollar. If the dollar is no longer the dominant or reserve currency in the world, the nation, that is the U.S. nation, and the working people are impoverished. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
I guess the last thing I would say, the European nations, especially the largest ones like Germany, France, Italy, certainly some of the smaller ones like Greece, will break away from the United States. And like Russia, pivot, as they use it here, pivot towards Asia. A multipolar world, multiple centers of economy, a currency situation where, if not a single dominant currency, several currencies, including the dollar, the Chinese yuan, the euro. And then, of course, there will be trade between nations that will be done in digital currencies. For example, Saudi Arabia and China. Remember when I came up to Cornell that time, I thought everybody would understand this. The petro yuan. In other words,
2017.
yeah, that was 2017. But for instance, Saudi Arabia and China dealing in oil in a currency that is specific to that trade. Different patterns of trade, for example, between Germany and Russia for oil and natural gas today. Russia provides 55% of the natural gas that Germany uses. 55%. You can't detach these two economies. They might act like they're going along with Biden's sanctions, but they can't, you know, and so many other things. But this movement to the east. And then, of course, I think this is already in the logic of developments, and we saw it in the last vote in the United Nations Security Council, where the United States and Albania put forward a resolution You don't know Albania like I know Albania. But put forward a resolution that condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine and called for Russia to withdraw, with a whole lot of other language. And Russia vetoed it, China abstained, United Arab Emirates abstained, which is interesting, but the big thing, India abstained. India voted with China and voted, in essence, with Russia. A new configuration, not to mention the size of the Indian and Chinese populations. A beginning of what we would call Pan-Asia. And then the Koreas coming together. You can't stop this now. It's only a matter of a corrupt, bought-off South Korean ruling class. And I think as the United States is forced to retreat and, quote, focus upon China, whatever they think that means, they will have to loosen their grip on South Korea, and so on and so forth. That's all I would say. Go ahead, Jerry.
Just to add, I think, just briefly, what you were saying about the end of the unipolar era, I think it's really striking because when you listen to like the mainstream Western media, like I was listening a lot to like The Economist, The New York Times, Wall Street Journal, all of those outlets, they're saying the exact same thing. Like they're saying it in those terms. This is the end of an era of, the triumph of liberal democracy, the end of history, all that stuff. And I think I was also thinking about, for a lot of younger people, those of us who were born like from the late 80s onwards, like this is the only,
Go ahead,
like,
I'm sorry.
I feel like,
No, forgive me, I'm only.
I mean, it is funny, but it's like, this is really the only reality we've ever known.
Right.
And so I think that in some way explains why there is I think especially amongst younger people, maybe more PMC type people, there is a genuine panic in response to the Russian thing.
Really?
I think you see it a lot on social media. Like people who are normally not very engaged politically are, all riled up now to condemn Russia. And I think there's also the whole racial part of it too, where I think the reason why Russia has always enraged the West and like Western liberals in particular is because they're supposed to act white, but they're actually not white, and they don't follow the norms and standards of the West, which I think is even more, I guess, sometimes enraging than even China. But yeah, I think just this fact that like now is the moment when the American people, I think, and I think the people of the world are being tested in a way. Like, can a people transcend just purely their own lived experience, quote unquote, and discover their connection to larger history? Can we see things in terms of the time scale of like how Russia sees things, how China sees things in terms of civilizations, and the logic of history and all that stuff? Or will we just be trapped in this sort of momentary thing where you're constantly being showered with all this propaganda and all this immediacy and all that stuff? And I feel like, yeah, it's a real test, I think, for the American people, but also I do think, as you were saying, like what Russia has done in response to these decades of basically being provoked by the West, of being threatened by the West, of the West promising Ukraine, I think during the Bush administration, that Ukraine and all these other post-Soviet countries could all join NATO, basically leading the Ukrainian people to be caught in the crossfires of all this. But, that basically what Russia has done in response to all this has created not just a challenge but also an opportunity to, like, obviously for, the Russian and Chinese and also Indian, like that possibility of what can be created with that, like how like even like the Western media is like, this is a new world order that's emerging. Like they can't even escape that fact. But in that context, what then do the American people decide to do? Because I think it's interesting, like even watching Tucker Carlson, because he points out that one, that like this whole thing with especially the sanctions will only make inflation worse, which is probably one of the highest concerns of, I think, most ordinary people in the country, but also that because the US ruling class is so diluted, that they're inadvertently creating the conditions for the collapse of the US dollar as the main currency, which Tucker is like, no, we shouldn't have that. Like, we need to protect the hegemony of the US dollar. But even he can see, like, that the ruling class is creating the conditions for their own demise, basically. And that, I think everything that we've been saying, like this whole question of philosophy and what philosophy does the ruling class have, they can't see their own contradictions. But it falls on basically I think it falls on the people to be able to see through that. And especially, like even the fact that this is happening at the same time as, the whole scandal or the crisis in Canada, like it's almost, it's kind of similar in some ways, not exactly the same, but how during the original Cold War, you could always point, the sharpest contradiction was with the black struggle, and basically the black struggle being able to point out, like, the US is trying to project itself as a democracy, but look at what this democracy means at home for black people. It seems like today, like, I don't know, the most visible sign of it is like, like Canada is now sanctioning Russia as like undemocratic, or threatening the democratic world order, but look at yourselves. And I think it's, I don't know, it's a hard, it's a moment where it's kind of hard to digest or really sink in how crucial of a historic moment it is. And I think especially because, at the same time, like, you really get a sense that, like, when you listen to the news, like, you have to listen, you become very conscious that you have to listen to it with basically, like, to understand that everything that they're telling you is a lie, or that, like,
that's constant.
like, I feel like it's become even more acute that, like, oh man, like, I'm going to listen to the New York Times, but only because I want to know how they're trying to sell this to me and trying to spin it. And I think, like, that has been the case for a long time, but I feel like especially now, like, it's become even more acute. And I think it does also, like, basically boil down to what you're saying of, like, the crisis of the legitimacy of the ruling class. But I think it's just, it really does feel like a moment of crisis, but also opportunity for the actual people of this country to define, like, how do we want the society to be governed, and do we want to choose the path towards, like, peace and an actual logical development of humanity, or, like, do we want to remain trapped in this illogical order that was created after the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Go ahead, Neil.
Yeah, I mean, I think the word that comes to mind is hubris.
What word is that again?
Hubris.
Hubris, oh yeah.
Like, I don't know, I think of, the recent history in this country, the Civil War, and how both the North and the West were just assuming that the slaves were just going to roll over and accept what the terms were, and we didn't have to necessarily touch slavery necessarily. But then the slaves, the blacks in this country said, hey, we're human too. We have a say in this. Whether or not you believe that is, you're going to have to come to terms with that reality one way or the other. And I as much as I see that in what's going on in Ukraine, like the Ukrainians in the East have said, no, we're human beings. We're not going to roll over. Russia has said they're human beings. We're not going to allow you to roll over them. China is now saying this is demonstrated. India is saying, hey, we're human beings too. We're not going to allow this to be what it is. And like you say, the West just doesn't want to believe it. They want to just plow on through, and eventually they'll just roll over, I guess. I mean, their partners in Europe have decided to go along and bend at the knee as they now demonstrated. But an interesting part of this, I read the entire statement that Putin made, and one thing that he admitted that I think he had said before was how in 2000 he went to Bill Clinton and said, I would like to join NATO.
Yeah,
You know,
right.
I've made all these capitulations. I've
remember
done
that.
everything you've asked. In many ways, he was the reliable person that the U.S. State Department had in there for his anti-communist views. So he assumed that they would be very, very willing to make a partnership. And at that point, it became reality that they weren't interested in a partnership with anyone. It's never been the agenda is servants. You know, they call it NATO. I think of it as the Association of American Servants. Vassal states. That's what it is, really. I mean, you know, Macron will say NATO is brain dead, and Merkel or whoever is president of Germany now will say, you know, we're going to go ahead with the Nord Stream 2.
Right.
But when push comes to shove, what are we seeing they're doing? They're following orders. That's what they're doing. But no one else is, and that's the problem. So, I mean, the reality is going to hit one way or the other, and that's what we're witnessing. Is what you're saying. I just thought that was a really interesting moment that Putin was frank and honest in that circumstance. And actually, I would recommend everyone, if you're interested in a really thorough and comprehensive analysis, read what he said. I mean, it'll take you about an hour or so to read.
Now, which speech is this?
This was a statement he made maybe yesterday or the 22nd about when he was acknowledging the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republic. He went through the history. And there's some anti-communism sprinkled in there as well, which I think points more to his fear of the Communist Party in Russia, because that's really growing now. That's his main opposition, which I think we can all be kind of happy about. So, I mean, Putin himself really, he strikes me, it's kind of ironic, he strikes me as like a moderate liberal, in the truest sense of that word. I mean, he's just so vehemently hated by the liberal establishment here. It's very ironic.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I was reading the book of Matthew the other day. You will know the fullness of their heart by how they speak. And you hear Putin speak, and it's always peace. We want to maintain peace. We're going to bring force there, but really our goal is to save as many lives as possible. And you hear what people say here, they're monsters. They just want to destroy us. We need to destroy them. It's very clear who's interested in peace when you just listen to the language.
Go ahead.
So I'm just making a backdrop. He says he's born in the 80s, and in my mind, looking at the events going on, because of these states being dismantled and the ones that they don't want to be a state. But when I think about Chile and Nicaragua and shockwave from those problems amplifying what our states could eventually fail, because they failing, because the infrastructure that they saying that they paying for is really, you can't rehabilitate something that's, we witnessed Pennsylvania, we witnessed Ohio, we witnessed, I'm not going to use Maine, but we witnessed other states that are so depleted in their infrastructure for the well-being that you would think the pandemic would not be so rash, because this is supposed to be a modern, top of the modern society. But anyway, with Chile and the way the student movement was there, where we're sitting like right now, like that movement became like a new kind of bridge, because students actually were fighting for something that they never seen the students in the public view before like this. This is the kind of problem in the United States that they kind of geared to keep these students more oppressed, because the students are the ones that build these bridges to go engineer. They build these bridges to cut this continental thing. It's a continental divide. It has to change. this is the activity of the students, not because you're in the communist movement. So that is something that's challenging every individual. What are we gonna do? We're just gonna dismantle Pennsylvania because you dismantling, like, if you're gonna try to dismantle Russia, this is a federal. It's like we got federal power. This is a federation. This is like this is a true federals. If it's not a union, then it's a federation or confederation of power. That's a serious thing to say. You're gonna take something from our federal structure. That's like taking Washington D.C. Said, well, it's just temporal. No one stays there.
Can I ask you a question, Dave?
Yeah.
So you're saying that the United States, in dismantling the Soviet Union, is that what you, okay,
Well,
I'm sorry.
you attempting to disrupt a federated system that
Right.
involve individuals collectively ruling sound. Just like we have like we're supposed to be federal, we're supposed to be better than whatever the government is supposed to be trying to do. You can't feed us. So what is our federation doing? Nothing.
No, you're absolutely right
They're
about
not
that,
doing
yeah.
anything. But if the students don't look at these places like Nicaragua, and I'm not saying to go across to the ocean, it's where the problems lies right in our hemisphere. That they can't dismantle Cuba because the consciousness in Cuba was much greater than sometimes in Russia or China. This is just because the persons they have not weaponized their minds. They have real, genuine doctors. Doctors, you know what a doctor say? That you got this for not just being in school. They apply these things. We just trying to make an attempt to get our stuff on this table in Church of the Advocate. They built the damn table, put it right in. We're gonna do this right now, and it means something in these other countries that Russia has rehabilitated these years. Has been like an incubator for them. They have resurfaced again. Nobody wants to see Russia. Russia went from the 19th century and maybe they was in the 21st century in the 1950s because no one is looking for Russia in the 1940s to be like, yes. And then you got China. My God, they can't do nothing with China. They can't do nothing but sit back and say, how long we got? Because they can't do anything with this confederation of understanding not just democracy in China. They understand democracy that was in Chile. They knew what was going on in Argentina. They knew what was going on in Venezuela. Otherwise, the people in Russia, sometimes they're like got a cosmos. They're looking at everything. Well, we just get the newspaper and say, go out and do whatever you want to do. Everything for them is like, we're doing this like, this is like a 50-year plan. They might have done what we're going through. It might have been a 60-year plan. They needed to have somebody that could be at the helm sometimes. But we ain't got nobody. If you say the United States, we must be the ones that sitting around this table with them because they're not really looking at the global impact of this shock wave that's going to affect our people first. Because we ain't used to carrying our stuff on our backs no more. We just think everything's got to roll up to us. But when the stuff got getting bad here, and we got to start carrying our own packages like everybody else, riding bikes across, then we'll say, oh my God, we know everybody was in such a massive depression from us living in this country, trying to dominate other people's way of life, like that, and the stuff and the things that they've done to Central America, and nobody ain't bat a hand about whether Nicaragua lost their rights to vote or whatever the countries that they want an honest election. It's supposed to be a democracy. They don't have we don't have they don't have the Monroe Doctrine like we have the Monroe Doctrine. Don't touch. They can't even come over here. It's like unheard of for them to come here up to push us to a new frontier where Russia can play their hand. They're not playing really, but they can play their hand because the odds is that the United States is on a losing, I call the losing slope. Because we don't have like one state that really signals how we collectively can do something. Every state got its own whatever.
Derek, let me call on somebody else. Thank you. Oh, go ahead. Hi.
Sorry I came late. I'm Angel. What you were saying made me think about how the U.S. applies sanctions to other countries. and how right now we're in such propaganda that, you know, no one is thinking about that critically, and how the U.S. is like, the U.S. has applied sanctions to all of these other countries when they step out of line, not caring about how that actually affects people on the ground. And I was thinking about how, you know, if you're on TikTok or Instagram or Facebook, whatever it is, all you see is like, oh, the Ukraine, the Ukraine, the Ukraine. Oh, the U.S. is applying sanctions to Russia. That's so good. You're seeing all of these pundits, and you're also seeing what's very concerning, like young people who are saying, like, yeah, we need to apply sanctions to Russia. We need to punish them for what they're doing. Putin is horrible, and we really need to, you know, all these sanctions are good. And they're not thinking critically about what the sanctions are, and also how they're applied, and also how, you know, I was thinking a lot about how different the conversation is when the sanctions are applied towards Venezuela or towards other countries that are trying to establish a kind of socialism, or just just doing things out of line with how the ruling class here in the United States wants it to go. And also how I was thinking about how different the response is between what's happening in Ukraine and how what's happening in Yemen, what's happening in Palestine, and how that's talked about within media, and how there's just such a different, it's a completely different like shift and turn, and you're just seeing this kind of manufacturing of consent for war that is coming from the New York Times, but it's also coming from places that you wouldn't expect, like young people who just see this information, they're like, Ukraine, we gotta jump on this, without having the critical education and the understanding of the history of what the U.S. has done and is doing to the global South, and how the U.S., when it applies sanctions, murders so many people, and so many colonized people, and they don't care about that. And in this context right now with Russia, they're like, yes, this is good, because we're seeing, you know, we're seeing all these reports in the New York Times about how unjust this is, but they don't know the accurate history. And I saw a New York Times article the other day that was criticizing Putin's speech that you were referring to on the history of Russia's relationship with Ukraine, and they're characterizing it as Putin is something like Putin tells this history. Of course, he's saying all the wrong things. Of course, he's making stuff up, right? And it's just this like ahistorical revisionist history that really starts at in our education in school, and then works all the way up to the media, and then goes right back to kids and young people who take all of this information in and don't know. If you already start from a place of American exceptionalism, you're never going to break out of that and see historically and currently how the U.S. weaponizes consent to manufacture, interest in war. And the amount of people that I've heard talk about like World War III and the draft and making it a joke really diminish how the U.S. has had all of these proxy wars and all of these, other conflicts through the use of sanctions, through the use of lifting up all these other, groups like.
Can I just say something about this? Is very important. If you don't mind me interrupting. What's your name again?
Angel.
Angel, Tony. It's fair because I'd read that article in the New York Times, and of course it was written by an American, and Putin was talking about the history of his country, and he was attempting to explain what he was going to do in Ukraine from a historical standpoint. Wouldn't it be interesting if an American president justifying whatever wars that they have been involved in by talking about the history of this country? So we have one country that is deeply enmeshed in its history and has a historical understanding. Whether you can, I don't think everybody would agree with everything Putin said in Russia, but we are so ahistorical and so arrogant that we don't think we need to know the history of our own country and its foreign policy. I think this is a very important, and it's a part of the delusion, the fantasy world that the ruling class lives in and tries to force upon all of us that their worldview should be our worldview under the guise of we're all Americans. Oh, really? So I just wanted to underline that point that you made. Anybody else wants to? Go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking about what Angel and Derek were saying. I mean, just another important context for all this is in 2014, there was the overthrowing of a democratically elected Ukrainian leader who said, I don't want to take an IMF loan, which is the same thing as, austerity here, which is what you're saying about Pennsylvania and like just the bleeding of our own country and forcing other people to accept that. But then that's why he was overthrown, because he wanted to work with Russia. And so then, I mean, even this whole narrative and the context in which it's happening, it's on the U.S.'s terms. This is not a Ukrainian state. I mean, it is a puppet state. It's not a state of the Ukrainian people. And I mean, just the way that this is such a moment where, it's not even someone else is going and, causing the U.S.'s downfall. I mean, we have done it to ourselves. They've done it to themselves through this coup, and which encouraged all these Nazi forces that are going and killing Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Or, I mean, Taliban, I mean, the best example of that, you support this group and look what happens. Or, all these things, it's all of our own doing. And that's also so interesting. I mean, what Putin said about, America being the playground bully, like you're saying, whatever they say, it's actually you. You're projecting it on other people. False flag operation in Ukraine. What is that? I mean, that's you. But and that's the irony. I mean, the U.S. has done all of this to themselves, and that's the beauty of the multipolar world. Like finally, the world can just breathe. It can do. People's will can actually be. But then, I mean, you're right. The conversation is 10 steps behind because Ukraine, save Ukrainians, and it's very much it's a class thing. Who is supporting it versus who is completely against this war because they don't want to see their gas prices go up to $6, $7 a gallon. So yeah, I mean, I think that it has to be, what's happened to Pennsylvania has to be connected to what the Ukrainian people have been forced to go through, with just the not giving them any alternatives, giving them this austerity.
The other thing about the 2014 coup was that was one of the occasions when the U.S. backed like a color revolution there.
Right.
And then you see all of that coming home to the U.S. with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think it's interesting because there's been like the whole like discourse about fascism and stuff in like the U.S. and Canada in the past couple years, but like I think like the Oliver Stone documentary about the 2014 Maidan Square color revolution was interesting because it showed like one like specifically like that Biden and then Victoria Nuland were like there like backing it directly, but I feel like it showed that like this sort of hazy definition of even fascism, where it's just like something about, like just being a nationalist or something. It's not really true. It's more about what is your connection to like finance, capital, like
Right.
this global elite. And I think, yeah, like I think it's good that like Russia has actually fought back against that force. And people in America have also fought back against it in their own ways. But then they get villainized as, the fascists, and Putin gets compared to Hitler and all that stuff.
Any of the philosophy of Russia and things you have to follow for some part of your whole course of your life. But when black people are put in a straitjacket for even having one, they couldn't even think of Lenin in school or mention anything about Russia. Like we just having a general conversation, because that's almost like you are targeted to be silenced. Like, so now it's just like we just want to have a world put in total silence, because Russia really reverberates. It's like a human feeling. When you don't have human feelings in the world, someplace in the hemisphere has got to have feelings. Whether it's Cuba, it's a genuine human feelings that go beyond regular ranges of feeling and thought, and that's something they can't put an iron curtain up to do. And the other one more point is, this country here is in the business of partitioning the smallest countries so that it can have a more dominant effect on any mass that's there, or the mass of people that will be in these general areas. The person said, we just want to live by ourselves. And this petition is a dangerous design of order.
Yeah, this unipolar world thing is also, I think we have to look at it from the standpoint of the state. One all-powerful state in the world, and every other state is weak compared to it. And so, for so long, the U.S. policy towards Russia after the overturning of the Soviet Union was to guarantee that the state never consolidated. Now, in Russia, it's a very fluid thing. I'm using the word fluid. I think it's more than that. A very contradictory process of reconstructing the state. And you're absolutely right. In whoever said, I think Meghna said, in the early 2000s, Putin actually was prepared to go along with becoming a subordinate to the West and to the United States. In a certain sense, that might explain a lot of his anger. And I didn't want to think it this way, but I think he may have been on the wrong side of the undoing of the Soviet Union. And he is yet not able to come to terms with his own role. And that huge mistake, a huge mistake, worse than a mistake. Because let's not forget, he was appointed as a vice president, a vice premier under Yeltsin. And I mean, there are no greater traitors than Boris Yeltsin. So a whole layer of Russian elites, many of whom were members of the Communist Party, even in leadership in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, now have to look back on what their role was. No one is against reform, but you destroy your own state? And you know how they did it in Russia? Not just by destroying its ideological foundations. Every state is based upon certain ideas, certain classes. Just like here in the United States, the founding fathers, that narrative. To undo that, to leave the Soviet and Russian people without well, what's going on? And then, just like Jeffrey Sachs, you've heard of him, oh, he's talking about how great the Chinese miracle is and all of that. Well, back in the day, Hometown was the one talking about shock therapy in Russia. They talk about oligarchs. You know where they came from? They denationalized these industries and just you take it, take that, take the other. Gave it to individuals. There was a precipitous decline in their population. You know, like what they talk about in the United States, people dying of diseases of anxiety and depression, alcoholism, suicide, all of that in the Soviet Union, the former Soviet. It was horrible. Now, and somebody got to say, look, I was on the wrong side. I think Putin is going to have to admit that. He can talk about how wrong Lenin was in 1922 till the cows come home. But Hometown, what was your role in 1991? And I'm not saying you can't change, but just fess up. And that was the great tragedy. But he is right about this when he says it. And I give him so much credit for saying this. The greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is very, very, listen, they lost 27 million in World War II, but they didn't lose the state. You have the state, you have the main mechanism of political power, of nationhood. You don't have the state. Anybody could come in and kick you in the behind. And that's what happened. It is, I was going to say a miracle, but it's really, I guess, dialectics working itself out, that they have come back in 20 years. I mean, they were done. And you know, like Jeremiah said, we didn't know nothing. You know, like they say, Angel, I was there. I wasn't over there. I was, and it was a downtime because the American ruling class went buck wild crazy. Hey, we won the Cold War. And Putin admitted this, I don't know if everybody heard this, he admitted in a speech a few weeks ago that in different agencies, including the Defense Department, whatever they call that in Russia, and these different departments, they had open CIA agents running the thing. This is, I mean, they were defeated, but somehow they built back. And their economy is, they keep saying, oh, it's not as big as Italy. No. Their economy is one of the strongest economies in the world. And I think you admit, Angel, you may have said it. See, the sanction thing is a double-edged sword. Sanctioning Russia ain't the same as sanctioning Venezuela. You understand what I'm saying? You are going to pay a price. And we don't know what the price will be. But this is a delusional ruling class. You've heard of the thing, brinksmanship? Keep pushing it to the edge. You know, like if I get Kathy, I keep pushing her up against, and finally she come out and say, shoot, I'm gonna fight my way out of this. Unintended consequences. And this is why the peace sentiment, and Biden is so dumb. He came out in the speech and said, hey, look, yeah, y'all gonna have to pay more for oil, but we're standing up for our vow. People said, what? Are you on dope? I mean, at this time, I mean, you know, the Greeks used to say, who the gods will destroy, they first make mad. You know what I'm saying? We could say who the gods will destroy, they first give fentanyl to. These give dope to. It doesn't make sense. They're irrational. Oh, okay. I hope you feel better.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. All right. See ya. Bye.
I think they have done so much to the people of the United States, and really a ruling class that's no longer able to rule. This is what we're faced with. But, you wanna say something?
Well, I guess I was gonna just say two things. I didn't even raise my hand. I
Yeah,
guess you kind
but
of
I
saw
could
that
say-
I had the
I-
thought bubble going on.
Yeah, you did.
I guess. So I guess two things. One, I was thinking of. So you're talking about like the U.S. is bullying in that sense, and so I was curious in this circumstance, and it's not clear. It might not be amongst the masses of people, but did the most militaristic parts of the government get what they wanted, which is they did want a conflict to break out so that they could beat the war drum and start, you know, all these campaigns, and my social media is just like hitting me on the face every 5 seconds with just bam, 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 all these things. And so I was like, do they still have that bullying power? Because it's not always beating up somebody, sometimes it's getting them to do something. And then the other thing, I was thinking about the multipolar world thing, and so I was starting to think, you know, you mentioned von Clausewitz, so he was a Hegelian as well. He read Hegel.
He was
So
a- yeah,
Fog
yeah.
of War is a Hegelian thing. But I was starting to think, like, the transition to that, you know, I was thinking of opportunities for socialism, but there might also be new obstacles in that sense. Meaning if, you know, if the dollar goes off the reserve and people in this country are impoverished more, that might incite more, you know, various kinds of prejudices and reactions and conservative. I don't know, but I can't say this, and so I'm asking what people think about how that would play out. And that's, I'm not expecting anyone to have an answer because that's like 50 million things or something. But you know, World War I was a multipolar world. And that was an inter-imperialist war, right? So that's
Yeah.
not always, you know, there could be a benefit in the sense that it opens people up to, as people were mentioning earlier, other ways of thinking about things, different kinds of democracy, not expecting, you know, change is an opportunity in the most neutral sense, meaning for good or for ill, right? Like, what possibility could there be? So I was just thinking of those two things. And that's for everyone, but it was off of Tony's comments at the beginning.
Everybody understand what Danny was saying?
So I was asking, did parts of the state get what they wanted in terms of bullying Putin into making a conflict? Because this is the whole thing about NATO going all the way up to the east, post,
yeah,
and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
that was one thing. And in terms of the multipolar world, what would be the possibilities for socialism and also potential obstacles? That would be, I hate to use this word, the dialectic, right? In other words, it would create new conditions and it could play out in different ways. And then the question would be, how could one intervene in that way?
Anybody want to try to, go ahead.
I mean, I would say they got the three main things that they seemingly wanted, which was the closing of the Nord Stream 2, the access to selling exclusively to Europe, and excuses to increase the military budget.
Right.
What they always want. So, in that sense, they
What
got
was the second one, Emil?
being the exclusive dealer of oil to Europe.
I thought that was a closing of North Star.
They go hand in
Oh,
hand.
okay.
That's part of why they wanted to close Nord Stream.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
they could extort.
That's why, so oil stock prices in the US just went like that.
Correct.
Like instantly
Correct.
and stuff like this.
Yes.
And Standard & Poor's, right, the criminals from 2008, right, that were faking all the credit thing, they've been attacking Russia, downgrading them credit-wise, so the whole thing is very political,
Yeah.
even in the finance thing.
So like from their own subjective opinion, they've gotten everything they want, but I think what we're noticing, or what we're sensing is objectively, what they're actually doing is shooting themselves in the
Right.
foot.
Yeah.
Because through this method, they have ostracized the rest of the community that they still want to have access to. They still want unlimited access to China. They still want the resources from Russia. They still want, you know, the influence that they used to have. They still want to say whatever they want from a loudspeaker and have everyone believe what they say. The problem is if you abuse that power, it comes with complications and you have to deal with them eventually. have to deal with them. But I still don't think they still wanna pretend that they don't have to deal with that. So objectively, it's a positive thing, I would say, just because the situation is objectively unsustainable.
Yeah, Trump ran on war exhaustion, so the counties that he won were people, it was usually veterans who were exhausted with the war, and, you know, that was like the strongest base for him in that sense. So I think I listened to him on, I guess it was the Buck Sexton show, I guess that's the guy's real name, but you know, Trump was saying like, this is dumb, we shouldn't be in war, we shouldn't go to war with Ukraine or something, or with Russia, and you know, 2024 is around the corner. So it's a little crazy what the Democrats are banking on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It definitely is crazy.
I think Tony, he mentioned Clausewitz, and maybe for us sitting at this table, I'm not saying it's the first time I heard his name, but it's much more involved, Clausewitz, in the last 100 years, because most of the war-footing people, we might be doing Hegel, it's in between Clausewitz, but it's a lot of other games, the development in Clausewitz, and all the opposing ways of understanding Clausewitz, and you want to use Clausewitz, but the opposing ways of Clausewitz has buried us strategically, more or less thinking about any kind of problem solving, because the nuclear deterrent kind of just put a blanket over Clausewitz, because everything that's
Can I just interrupt you? This is a very, I mean, I don't mean to interrupt, but I just want to highlight something you just said. With that overwhelming power with our nuclear weapons, the subtleties and historical understanding of Clausewitz was forgotten.
it's not yet.
Because go ahead, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
It's not that we can't apply Clausewitz. I'm not opposing Clausewitz no more than I'm opposing some twos. These is like two complementary ways of thinking about Western thought and Eastern thinking, or the dominant person. And we're like, you gotta have resistance. We're more or less in the resistance of the response, but that's the human ability, is to respond in some resistance, like anything chilling to the body or hot to the body. The body is trying to, it's the mass that I'm really speaking about, and we can't respond because the elements in Clausewitz, it's a political science, like Tony said, but in the Hegel worldview, it's much more topical, like Lenin would be. We would be operating like Lenin, and now we got some serious,
I agree with that.
come to grips with this kind of thinking,
Yeah.
and don't try to divorce it from out of this, any of these conversations, because this war is America is tore apart.
Yeah. Go ahead, Danny, and then Angel.
Very quickly, so
And
therefore,
then Emily, maybe we have some comments, yeah.
so therefore, you know, one thing we could do is point out to people, and you already raised this in your introductory remarks, that what's happening in Russia and Ukraine is bound up with the United States, right? It's bound up with different countries, and it's the way in which the ruling class is trying to carry its struggle with the people into a different form, right? That's why it's a very Hegelian thing, because it's a change in form with the same content. You mentioned Lenin earlier, and so he's like, World War I is the class struggle changing its form. And so most of the Second International didn't recognize that, and so they just thought it came out of nowhere. And he's like, read Clausewitz, right? So, okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Angel.
I was gonna say, I was gonna try to answer the second question you had posed about what are the obstacles to establishing socialism within this kind of situation, or what are the benefits. I think one of the main obstacles that I think I was also talking about before is that, like, we have a very rooted anti-communist Red Scare, like, society that we are living in, that make it so that, you can't even bring up socialism in many spaces without people thinking the worst. But then I also think, especially with this situation in Ukraine, it's bringing back a lot of that old rhetoric, and also making it as if, like, I think it's going to be tangled up in conversations around what democracy and what, you know, peace looks like, and doing so in a way that enables far right, and also I think far right political and also religious kind of conflict to occur, or support for those kind of ahistorical kind of movements or revisionist kind of movements. Because I think something that people often forget is that, at least in Ukraine, to my knowledge, like there's a large Catholic Christian population that is, and I'm also saying this, I'm Christian and I'm also critical of this. Many of those populations there, and also the immigrants here who are Ukrainian as well, who are also in that, there's a strong support for the anti-communist kind of movement and anti-Russian movement, which will kind of reinforce some issues there. But I think, like, with those things in mind, and with the situation in Ukraine kind of giving us a lens to examine what's before us and the kind of pursuit of socialism amongst this whole
Angel, could I ask you a
situation.
question?
Yeah.
How are you defining, what is the far right?
I think I would define it as the, at least within Ukraine, I think I would define like the far right as kind of reactionary organizations or leaders who are using the conditions of the material conditions to kind of push a narrative that is kind of leans in the fascist direction.
Now dig this, let me come
Yeah.
back to you now. No, I just, see, you know, I remember in the election of 2016, when, you know, there was this outcry, as was in 2020, that Trump is a fascist. And I said to a friend of mine, he was interviewing me, I said, if Trump is a fascist, then what does that make Hillary? You see how it might not be form and reality, or form and essence, might not always go so neatly together. See, Trump is the only president, I think, since Kennedy, that did not start a war or expand a war that the U.S. was already in. Now, we usually, don't we associate the far right and fascism also with war? That's all. I just wanted to see. It's a complicated one, and I think it gets to the question that you put on the table too. And I think what you just, do the ideological political conditions exist in full or in part for transition? Let us say, to a radical democracy that could lay the foundation for socialism. I'm asking that question. And who is the far right? Go ahead, Aid.
I think this is a really good interjection that you made. I think, like, you're right in that there are similar, like the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have the same interests. They just like lay it out differently. But I think, in terms of at least what I'm thinking of as the far right in both in the Ukraine and here in the U.S., it's like there's a much more, I think, reactionary populist energy that is like weaponizing language, specifically among, I think, working class peoples, to agitate for issues and things in a way that would severely like hamper and limit political consciousness. And I think that the ideological and the political awareness here in the U.S. Is very low. But I think we've seen like glimmers of it growing. I think like what happened in 2020 with the Black liberation struggles around police brutality was a glimpse, was a spark of what the people can do when they are rising up against the conditions forced upon us. But I think in terms of the barriers of the struggle for any kind of socialism, it really starts with like the lack of organization within the left, the lack of moving from our individual understandings of things to collective effort towards working in our community.
Could I ask you, do you consider Tucker Carlson far right?
I think I would.
Yeah. Okay. You see the problem, don't you? Yeah. This is a very. Yeah. Well, I won't. Let me. I mean, I'm just. You dig where it's at. Go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of comments, by the way. I mean, it's a really good conversation. It's also a very Hegelian conversation. But, I mean, everything we just said also reminds me of something you said earlier, Doc, which is, like, what happens when we're living in a moment where the ruling class believes its own propaganda? You know? Like, it's not just... Yeah,
the truth.
exactly. Which is also why Tucker Carlson becomes so good, like what he says, what he's putting together, even if you agree with his political intentions or not, why he's saying it's not following the propaganda of the ruling class. But there's a lot that like I kind of wanted to respond to, but I think a lot of the comments are actually doing it. The recent comments are trying to answer Danny's questions. Jahan says, I think this relates to our discussion of populism. There may not be the ideological clarity of the USSR today, but there is an increasing clarity about the contradiction between the US ruling elite and the working masses of the world that is taking the form of different kinds of populism. The ruling elite vampires sucked on the poverty of Russia and the post-Soviet states. Putin emerged with his contradictions as a populist, crucially keeping majority state control over Gazprom, one of the world's largest energy companies. This has allowed Russia to re-industrialize. The Western color revolution since 2014 has been de-industrializing and impoverishing the masses of Ukraine. Don't forget, Trump was first impeached for asking the Ukrainian President Zelensky to investigate Biden's corruption there.
Oh shit.
This Ukraine crisis coincides with the People's Trucker Convoy going to Washington. The U.S. elite is threatened by populism on all sides, at home and abroad. Yeah, and some of this conversation actually reminds me, especially Emil, you brought up the comment about Putin and the kind of anti-communism crumbs in his speech, but it actually kind of reminded me of King in some ways, where King made the point in his pilgrimage to nonviolence. He was like, I'm not saying communism has its weaknesses or whatnot, but ultimately the question becomes, like he says in various speeches, he says like a state and a society that cannot address people's grievances will naturally push people to socialism. Like it will naturally push people towards real democracy. And I don't know why it just kind of made me think about the direction of the world today, this thing of because I think sometimes there's almost too procedural of a distinction between what people think is democracy and then what people think is communism or socialism. But it just goes back to Du Bois and this idea of Du Bois's understanding of democracy and people's strivings, where he says in Russian America, he's like, naturally the world, like a world that has been in crisis and war, will force people to become basically communists, to strive for democracy. Okay, let me continue with the comments before we get more. Helen Logri has reappeared in the comments. She has a lot to say. She says, quote, turn imperialism wars into civil war, Lenin. Trump was an interloper. The ruling class of both parties ganged up on him. No, Tucker Carlson is populist right. So she's redefining.
She says that Tucker Carlson is what?
Populist right.
A right popular.
She also says, okay, this is her answer to Danny's question. Yes, the Biden administration got what it wanted, a war to distract from a second Great Depression caused by bankers, deterioration in material conditions. Samir says Russians and Ukrainians had to resort to sex slavery to make ends meet after the fall of the Soviet Union. And then pointing to the hypocrisy in the West. Today, sections of the Western left glorify sex work. Helen Logri says, yep, Clintonites were present all over Russian government and economy in the 90s, just like they have been all over Ukraine since 2014, until 2022, lol. American oligarchs hate nothing more than a puppet that cuts his strings. Putin kicked out the Western cowboy capitalists and they want back in. The politicians working for the ruling class intentionally darvo their intended targets in order to get the public to become the flying monkeys.
Become the what?
The flying monkeys.
What is the flying monkey?
Oh.
I think it's a...
Wizard of Oz.
Oh, sorry.
There's a lot of fun language.
Okay, this is Helen again. I suspect the ruling class knows exactly what is going on historically and discuss behind closed doors motives that they can never reveal to the public. So all their public pronouncements are for public consumption and public manipulation only. Kathy Freeman Bowen said, good point, Tony, and she was referring to your conversation with Angel about history, the ahistorical, just ahistoricism. Helen again says, lol, sanctions, this is with Angel, your point about sanctions. Helen says, sanctions only shoot Europeans in the foot. They'll be price gouged by relying upon only American suppliers. Okay, and now we're going into the earlier conversation and comments from there. Helen again says, yes, Putin is always juggling the wishes of the majority of constituents who still mourn the loss of the Soviet Union on one hand, and the wishes of the ruling class Russian mafia oligarchs who benefited from it and who could remove him from power.
And did what?
The ruling class Russian mafia oligarchs who benefited from it, benefited from the fall of the Soviet Union and who could remove him from power. So she's saying that Putin is torn in two directions. Those who yeah. And then Helen also has some advice for the current moment. Stock up and grow food at home and in community because the collapse will plunge the USA back into widespread Great Depression conditions. Then be alert to both opportunities to organize revolution and to the controlled opposition version of that, like Black Lives Matter. An had some comments earlier. I think someone referenced the Ukrainians in the U.S. Who are speaking out a lot, and I think it was actually Angel who mentioned this. An says, on the topic of the Ukraine conflict, we are seeing the refugee argument rise again among progressive left circles. It is obviously unfortunate that people are suffering instability, but having the refugee bloc now gives the Democratic Party a moral legitimacy to continue to antagonize on the world stage. Same that we've seen in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and others. A small trend I've noticed online is that self-proclaimed liberals, out of a belief in the American duty to our allies, have been more war-hungry than conservatives. A Democratic representative even pushed for the expulsion of all Russians from the U.S. It's incredible how quick the war drums beat, quite sad. Helen also has constructive criticism for how we talk about women. She says, please do not evaluate women by our looks. But I think what you were saying about Hillary Clinton was, it's a manifestation of the internal ugliness of the war machine.
Well, it's, yeah.
George Soros also looks like that.
And actually, Biden, they deteriorate. No, Helen, I was, no. See, I think this is a lesson for all of us. If you live a lie, it catches up with you in many ways, and you begin to become ugly. I mean, it's the tension within the body, within the brain. And Hillary has led a torturous life. It is not a pretty. It's not a pretty life, and yeah, that's what I was actually saying, Helen. Mm-hmm.
Also, when you're talking about party, you were like, I think you're making a joke about like the party days. It reminded me a lot of that book, Picture of Dorian Gray. You make a deal with the devil.
Dorian Gray.
But Helen does say Hillary does have anger management issues.
Yeah.
But so do most sociopaths.
So does most who?
Sociopaths.
So, I'm sorry.
And then, okay, Vaughn Allen Goodwin, who says hello from Boston, says we also should talk about the organization of non-aligned countries as part of its matrix.
Yeah.
Right.
India is vying for political position on the global stage. They're like the middle child.
They're like the what?
Middle child.
The middle
Yeah,
child.
India is like the middle child.
The middle
this is-
child.
No, Vaughn, I don't agree with that. But go ahead.
But yeah, yours.
Well, I mean, maybe not to all of this, but this abstention is so interesting and important. I mean, and also this right-left thing, like the left-wing, supposedly progressive media is like, oh, how could they do this? And we have to help Ukraine and blah, blah, blah. But it's this like right-wing government, whatever that means, that's taking this, they're more to the left of the media and the intelligentsia, which is all supporting Ukraine. I'm basically following the West. So I think, that dividing line between, and this is a time when India is making a choice,
Yeah.
and that's how that's how you evaluate people in motion. Going back to Hegel, you evaluate people for, everything changes all the time. So what decisions are people making now? What history are they drawing on? What are they continuing?
I like that.
Yeah.
I'd also like to add to that India and Russia, the Soviet Union, they have a historical tie. So you can say that the current government in power is right wing or this, that, whatever. But the Indian state has historical ties to the Soviet Union. So you can't really discount that. We've been talking about how, you have to take stock of what's happening in the world, but have a historical analysis. So so there's that too. So the middle child thing, right?
And there's an online journal called India Punchline, which I would recommend because to get a sense of the richness of, what you could call the oppositional Indian intelligentsia. It's some of the best writing. And Vaughn, just on that point, I agree with Meghna and Portaba. India now has to decide. It tried not to. The Modi government tried not to have to decide the question of what side they would be on in this grand geopolitical reconfiguring of things. And I think this will be a very beautiful thing, that India will now make not a strategic shift, but a tactical shift. Because, every government they have to bring their constituents along with them. But I think that India is prepared to now make a very important stance. And I saw it in the vote and the statement of the Indian ambassador in the UN Security Council 2 days ago, or maybe yesterday, yeah.
And then one last comment from Dr. Lorenzo Woodson. He says, Russia has sophisticated arms as well. We must not underestimate Russia's military capacity and capability and its support for that military technology from China over the last 30 years. This could be a mutual destruction framework.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's the danger of the moment.
True.
But isn't it the danger of every transition?
True.
And I'm not at all, I mean, like Jake Sullivan and Anthony Blinken. I mean, first of all, they're not very smart. They went to elite universities. They're pampered. They don't know very much. And they're trying, you know, as they say, to perpetrate a fraud, you know, on a world scale. And they're selling wolf tickets and nobody's buying them. I hate to use that kind of like, go ahead, Jerry.
Well, I guess to Helen's comment about the ruling class not believing its own lies, I feel like it is a genuine question today. Like, is it, because I think, would you say it's true that during the original Cold War, the ruling elite basically were like, we're spitting out this anti-communist propaganda, but they were like kind of laughing behind closed doors about it. Like basically like knowingly that they were lying to people. Whereas I feel like maybe it's the case today that, you know, American elites have basically inherited all of these frameworks of the Cold War, but like they don't even know, you know, like the actual like joke, I guess. And that basically like part of the reason why they're so dysfunctional and why all of their attempts to, you know, reassert their hegemony or their dominance like end up failing so catastrophically is because they are like they believe what they're actually selling to people to some extent. Although I'm sure there's also like some degree of just conspiratorial aspect to it. But yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I would say this. The American ruling class today is far more dangerous and far more committed to war than were the elites in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and so on. They were much more divided over war and détente with the Soviet Union. There were those among them who felt that they could outmaneuver the Soviet Union, like Kissinger, you know, separate China from the Soviet Union, get them aligned with us, and so on and so forth. I think what we're looking at today, and I would argue, in large part, it is due to the collapse of the Soviet Union. That balancing, to balance it out, that they went buck wild crazy and said, now is our opportunity to become the most powerful empire in human history. And now that has come to an end. It has come to an end. And you're right. I agree with Helen and everybody else. We don't know how they're going to act because they are so invested ideologically and psychologically in this lie, this narrative, this fiction that they've invented. You know, demonizing people who don't go along with them, attempting to overthrow governments and kill people, and all of that. And I think it's now, objectively, it's come to an end. And I think Ukraine was the occasion for this to be completely manifested. That's the way I feel. I feel they're much more warlike today than they were during the Cold War. They were more prone to détente and peaceful coexistence, especially by the time of the 70s. And then, if you all will, just look up the Helsinki Agreement of 1975, which was about an architecture of peace and security in Europe. They, after 1991, they tore that up. And that's this whole, and that's why you got this push of NATO to surround the Soviet Union. And then saying to Russia, hey, you don't have anything to say about this. Now, how do you, it's just mind-boggling. You know what I'm saying? So that's what I would say. And that's with the war in Vietnam and all that other shit. This is far more dangerous group of people.
I would also add, I think, like the old dying guard of the ruling class.
Say that one more time.
The old dying guard.
Uh-huh.
The Nancy Pelosi's, the Chuck Schumer's, the Colin Powell's, who's literally dead, Dick Cheney and those. I think Trump represents a fissure. I think, I don't think Tucker Carlson gets on the corporate news station saying what he says if there isn't a serious divide among powerful people and powerful institutions in society.
Right.
I think they're both committed to hegemony, but I think they have very different ideas about how that can be accomplished, and they both have they're both not really rooted in reality in many ways. But I wanted to address this idea of right and left too, because I think this is also a very black and white binary that is created in this country, and it just doesn't really hold. I mean,
That's true.
this is something my father always tried to instill in me, is this idea is that people aren't stupid. Whatever you think, don't believe for a moment that the people are stupid. They're living in a material world, and they're making their decisions from their material reality. So is it the fault of the people or the left and the Communist Party that the communists and the left are so unpopular? Like, whose fault is that? Who is failing to communicate something here and understanding a reality that people are living with? This idea of right just being bad and left being good. I mean, we're even this idea of socialism, I think is like people we consider on the right in this country who see socialism as bad. Well, they live in a highly planned economy. They do. America is an extremely tightly planned economy. It's a socialistic economy in that sense. It's tightly planned not for the people. It's tightly planned for what they say, socialism for the rich. They recognize that. They see that for what it is. So when you say socialism, they see that. And that's because it's been separated from its historical context as a push towards a more communal communist society. It's been removed from that. So we want to keep barking old terminologies and talking about Lenin's thesis in 1921. It's a movement. It's like we're saying, we need to stop thinking in these black and white ways and understand there's a relationship here, and people are dealing with material situations that have developed in this way.
No.
Well, I mean, what else was Trump saying when he said bring the manufacturing back?
Yeah.
That's a planned economy.
Yeah.
That's what people are responding. They're saying give us control over the economy again.
Yeah.
I mean, it cannot be in the control of finance capital.
Yeah.
That's what people are responding to. Yeah, I mean, and also this woke elite that's like, they're so much less racist and less homophobic than you. I mean, is that socialism? No, that's what people identify with socialism, is wokeness, which is not organic to working people. Yeah.
Could I just say this? I think, and I agree with what you're saying. You can't fight the wars of 60 years ago, the ideological wars, because the form of the ideological struggle is different today. And you have to understand all the influences upon people and have a narrative that speaks to them. But here's where I differ with the woke people. They attack the people.
Yeah, they do. They do.
Our ideological opponents are not the masses. Our ideological opponents are the ruling class. And, the dominant ideas of any society are the ideas of those in power, because they have the power to advance their ideas in ways that we don't. But, example of this, I don't listen to WURD a lot, but I have a friend that does religiously. WURD is the black talk radio show. And, he told me that all of the hosts are supporting, are against Russia and are supporting the Biden administration on WURD. This is a black station. All of the hosts. Of course, it's very disappointing to hear that. It's inexcusable. There's no way to say, oh, they don't know. They're grown just like we are.
Right.
But, see, what is the problem, I think? the nexus of the problem is that in defending Biden's war policies, they're defending Biden against Trump. Trump is against the war. Tucker Carlson is against the war. So the war must be good. And don't forget, before Barack Obama, black people in polling data were more anti-war than the American population as a whole, opposed almost every war. Then Obama comes in, and we have to stand behind Obama, and therefore we have to stand behind his war policies, including in Libya. These are questions. Now let me show you another part of this, if you don't mind me raising this. On the Security Council, there are 3 African nations right now on the Security Council: Ghana, Kenya, and Gabon. Now, let me just say, I go back to 2011, when the Security Council voted on whether or not to allow bombing of Libya, you know? And I remember that at that time, I think there were 2 African nations on the Security Council: Nigeria and South Africa. Now, South Africa, and of course the bombing of Libya was bombing to get rid of Gaddafi, a regime change operation, the most brutal form of it. The ANC had received over the years incalculable financial and political support from Libya. And I will never forget the speech of the representative of the ANC, you know, demonizing and attacking Libya and Gaddafi, and of Nigeria. Now, these are 2 African nations giving European countries the right to bomb another African country. But not only another African country, but an African country led by the most significant Pan-Africanist of his generation. That is what Gaddafi, in fact, Gaddafi was talking about a single African currency. Yusuf, he knows what I'm saying. But, so then we go up to 2022. I'm listening to Ghana, I'm listening to Kenya, I'm listening to Gabon. Empty rhetoric, disguising the fact that they're on the side of the West and they don't want to take any position that would upset the West. Then I come and listen to WURD, Black Radio Talk Show. For instance, if I called in, they would recognize my voice. Oh, that's Dr. Montero. Okay, yeah. I want to, take a position against the Biden administration. They would get me off the phone. First of all, they wouldn't invite me, even though I'm probably one of the few people in Philadelphia, black people, that has ever been to the Soviet Union. But it is that, and this is what Glenn Ford talked about the black misleadership class. So our struggle ideologically, and I always see it this way, I'm not waging no struggle against an ordinary person. Let's say that person is a black person, hardcore Christian or Muslim, and doesn't believe in same-sex marriage. Well, I'm going, denounce them and you ain't this and you, no. I want to go at the ruling class. I don't care if the ruling class is for same-sex marriage or not. I want them. Because same-sex marriage is a way for them to disguise their real intent and motive, to bring all working people down, no matter what your marital form is.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That's where I don't understand this other thing. I think, matter of fact, that's why I think the whole Black Lives Matter and Me Too. I think that's all a part of the ruling class's ideological offensive against the working class. And if you look at it, ain't no Black Lives Matter leaders come out against war yet. Ain't none of the Me Too loudmouths. I believe her. Well, why don't you believe the Russians then? I think the equation, it's so clear to me. And I wonder why it's not clear to other people. Maybe because they're young and inexperienced. But sometimes you got to grow up. Sometimes you got to grow up fast because the stakes are high. That's what I would say. No, I ain't attacking the people, the ruling class. And I agree with you. The argument for socialism, really the argument for a new radical democracy has to be made. And you could call it what you want. Don't have to be, I ain't arguing, you don't like socialism? Let's talk about it. But what do you feel about a radical democracy?
We want a
I'm sorry.
coalition, not a purity contest. A coalition, not a purity contest.
That's right. That's right. A united front of the people. You know, like in the 1930s, they trying to organize the industrial industries. You know, the industrial sector of the economy, auto, steel, electronics, and all that kind of stuff. They said black and white unite and fight. They didn't say black and woke white people unite and fight. Black and white unite and fight. Because once you're in the fight, it has a, transformative.
Yes.
You don't like black people, right? But this black man or woman is the hardest fighter for the union. I want a union. I'm transformed through struggle.
Yeah, some of us read a speech by Kim Il-sung given, I think, during the Vietnam War, and he makes the exact same point, which is that whoever gets involved in the struggle for peace against imperialism, no matter where they come from, they will get transformed through the struggle.
There's
That
no
will be the
question.
test of their commitment because they will be immersed in the struggle. And yeah, I think we have never really been taught that lesson.
No, we don't, and it seems like every generation has to be taught that lesson. And we lose time, so much time, valuable time, with things that you would think are so obvious, but apparently they're not. Apparently they're not. And
That's one of the reasons destroying the unions in I'm just saying Philadelphia in particular. I worked in factories, but I also worked around people that was conscious about, what was taking place. Unions didn't sound like capitalism. Unions had more, we're gonna help each other do this, or y'all gonna be delegates, and you went to big businesses with your delegation. Or some, that like that. But to wipe that out,
that's, oh yeah.
that was like you wiped out Pennsylvania.
Because union people tended to have a higher level of consciousness than non-union people. A high level of consciousness. That doesn't mean they had the ultimate consciousness. They were not, but they had a higher level. They understood organization. One of the things about Henry Nicholas in this city, and I disagree with Henry about the Democratic Party and and his idea that if we elect black people who were whose elections were dependent upon the black community, we could shift the way things. I greeted that with a lot more skepticism than he did, but his union and him in particular were agents of consciousness. I wouldn't lie to you. And a real, you could see it. I'm sorry.
That's what's missing in our educational values in school. All the things that in socialism, not saying that it was a big plaque on the wall somewhere, but everything that we're talking about was something that the unions would, my child or my uncle or somebody said something to you. Everybody just didn't walk around like
Oh, yeah.
that things didn't matter. You know, no one was rich. No one, you know, say you got to be rich to get to be better or to feel better. But putting unions down, that was a real self-destructive thing. Me growing up, and you had places where you worked at when you got out of school or after school, that was a vital link to your future. Whether you worked in a machine shop or you was an apprentice, or just it was just something that
Oh,
it was just something that
Oh, yeah.
assisted you
Yeah.
to get where we sitting right now. Something assisted people to come to the church or the advocate with their skills. And
Oh,
we
yeah.
don't know how many different people, electricians and all kind of things that has happened that has disappeared from out of our entire communities, from bricklayers to painters to paper hang, all of these real beneficial type trade, intellectual trades. I'm not
Yeah,
talking about
yeah.
just trades, okay, intellectual trade things.
And you know,
Misleading.
and I think you would agree with me about this, Derek. You know, I don't care whether you were 10 years old or in high school, if your parents were in unions, union values and working class values were part of your family. You know, because if you had union people in your family, they were proud, they were always talking about the union. The other thing is that in churches, trade unionists tended to be in the highest positions of the church. So that overlap. And then if you went to a place like Detroit with the UAW and the role of blacks in the UAW, everything in Detroit, black Detroit, was run literally by members of the United Automobile Workers. I agree with you, and that has affected, especially the longshore, but that has definitely affected the life of the black community in Philadelphia. I can say for certain, the lack of that union element, it made all the difference in the world, and therefore there's a lot of things, even the violence that goes on. If you had more union men and women, they know how to handle things in a different, organized way. I didn't mean to cut you off.
This is, you say the Philadelphia Negro, and we are living Philadelphia, and people that I have grown up like, for my entire life, it was a lot of inborn skills that got passed from in families. It's just it's unbelievable that to have tailors, and these are all little intricate things that for me is the seed in the culture that helps us. The same thing that's going on in Russia, with the stakes are high, and it's more galvanized there, where Philadelphia would have been a mirror of some things about Russia because of
I think you're right.
the workmanship and it's just real.
But Derek,
significant
isn't
things.
that common character of workers all over the world?
Yes.
I mean,
was
there
taught like
is
that.
something common there.
I was taught like that.
Yeah. And you will find, and I found that workers tended to be more internationalist. For example, you take the anti-apartheid struggle in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Part of the hardest organized drive against South African goods coming into was down the waterfront. And just even take, a person that, Magna writes about, Lucian Blackwell. Now, Lucian, like Henry, Lucian, the same thing. They had this deep belief in the Democratic Party. That came out of the New Deal and the Roosevelt time. And then, of course, the unions themselves, above and beyond them as individuals, were in the Democratic Party. And that, of course, goes back to the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt. But the quality of leadership they brought into black Philadelphia it's immeasurable. Once you deindustrialize, once you bust up unions and all that, let me just say, if I could say, Angel, dig what I'm coming from. When I was a little boy, and when he was a little boy coming up, damn near everybody worked, and damn near everybody that worked was in a union. It was a given. I know as a little boy, I'd be sitting on the steps, and it was just, I would look with such pride at these men and women coming from work. There's Mr. So-and-so. He got a good job.
Yes.
You remember that word? A good job. Yeah, Tony, he got a good job. Oh, here come Lathan. I remember a cat named Lathan in my neighborhood. Lathan, one of the things about him, hell of a cat with his hands. You know what I'm saying? I saw him knock out a couple cats. But he worked in the construction industry. Lathan come home, stroll, just nice looking cat. Union people, dressed good. They knew how to dress, hat, all that, dance. That's in Black Philadelphia. You may have been working in a poverty wage job. You're working. Get out of high school, you're getting a job. You work for the summer. Everybody's working. You don't work, man, people look down. What you doing just laying around? What you a hustler? Whatever's going on, And almost everybody that worked at a union. Unions all over the damn place.
So Philadelphia was really not a makeshift city. Philadelphia was like for young people. Philadelphia was a working, walking. So you walk to work. You could walk to your job. You could get a job in
He
your
ain't
if
never
you had a
lied.
job in your neighborhood.
Walking.
You could walk to work. You ain't say you took the bus.
Or get on the trolley.
Yeah,
but walking, you right.
But everything that you could dream of, you never had no money to do anything. At least we wouldn't be broke and barren-minded like what they done left us with. Like when I'm walking about, I used to play with it where the coal is delivered before it comes to your house. Mm-hmm. And so Philadelphia was a real important place for coal to be shipped, and railroads were so valuable. You couldn't even think without a railroad set. I had railroad sets. You could not think without the railroad what that did for Black people from Chicago to New York, from Philadelphia to Washington. Mm-hmm. Black people would get together before you even thought there was no train system, and they already was riding the train. Have you tried to define, could they get on the train? They're on the train already. They're already in the next city, and because people couldn't believe that we was traveling. My dad worked for Reading Railroad, so I know about trains. We traveled. We ain't never sat still. And this was vital for the way I'm thinking. Like the people in Russia, they can think of having a train to go from, to be able to go to some other city that you couldn't get to. And they building it during Crimea. They built the damn thing over whatever the Black Sea is, so that the people can communicate. That's in Pennsylvania for me. I'll be like, why are we getting stuck in Philadelphia and we live in the state south?
Let me show you another thing. And with this working class and with these unions, you had a public education system where, the predominantly white high schools had better facilities. But, if you talk about like Overbrook, West Philly High School, and stuff like that, they became, after the blacks, Overbrook, they was kind of integrated for a while, but, hey man, it was not just everybody trying to be no basketball player.
Right,
There were people, there were choirs. Every high school had choirs and singers and orchestras, and everybody wasn't thinking about going to college. A lot of people, I'm gonna finish high school, then I'm gonna get a job. And you would have these songs, get a job, Yeah, that was a fake. Look it up. And then they came out with the sequel. Well, I finally got a job. I swear to God. Am I lying, man? You know, and I mean, it was a thing like, I can't tell you, get a job. And if you don't get a job, you're not. And look, you couldn't go out on a date. You know, I mean, let me just say this one last thing. Where people, you know, like dating was like, you know, you want to take, you know, whoever to a movie or something like that, and you know, of course, it wasn't no, you was on a trolley, but you needed a job just to date. You know, you needed a job to put on clothes where you could present yourself. I mean, this is the real deal. But once you take that working class thing out of the mix,
Yeah, that's true.
and done lumpenized everybody, the lumpen proletariat, and then you got music that romanticizes the lumpen, not the working class. I mean, to put it mildly, it's a world that I don't quite understand. I ain't comfortable with it. Like they said, I'm gonna get a job.
I have a question for this. So
Okay.
did you find that maybe the word socialism, because of the propaganda at the time, might have been too controversial word?
No.
But that people could have been more receptive to ideas of socialism, because you're talking
Yes.
about people that have jobs, they're organizing their life,
Oh,
they're
definitely.
cooperating with each other. Like, to me, it seems like the idea of socialism would have been so easily receptive then, whereas when people don't have work, don't have jobs, don't have community, it's hard to be like,
It's an abstraction.
yeah.
I,
abstraction.
you know something, and I could be wrong about this. I feel the ideological struggle is far more difficult today. I think, you know, I mean, look, anything in terms of political organizing is talking to people.
It is.
And everybody ain't gonna agree. But then you had, of course, with the rise, the civil rights movement, you would have all of these organizations that were socialist. For example, the Black Panther Party, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, like Stokely Carmichael would say, we're not just socialists, we're scientific socialists, you know, like that. And of course, the communists. And I would have to say, and of course, the Nation of Islam, and the, you know, Muhammad Speaks newspaper, and like, you know, the interview. Now here you get a black newspaper of a religious organization that's interviewing Kim Il-sung of North Korea, you know? Or if I think maybe even some of the national liberation fighters in South Vietnam. So it was, I think it's more difficult now. Go ahead, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's just the one thing I'm really kind of thinking about. Because on the one hand, like, it's easy to agree generally that there's, like, a lot of propaganda and then everybody doesn't know anything and, you know. I mean, I don't want to talk down to anybody. I know everybody has, you know, their viewpoints, what they're interested in. They have families, they have kids. They have their own lives they need to take care of. Healthcare, cars, houses, all that.
Definitely.
Education especially. So I don't really want to take that, but I know that propaganda, you know, with social media, CNN, that it's crazy. And it is bombarding in a way. But I guess this is kind of like why, like, Trump or the, you know, the situation around him, or even him coming back in the next elections, it's interesting still how he still engages the public of people.
There's no question.
And
There's no question.
like I think there does need to be kind of stages, maybe, if you will, to build kind of America or whatever, the infrastructure that kind of back to a more stable situation. I see that too. I think that might help with being able to like have a more scientific and educated understanding amongst the masses of people. But at the other hand, I don't disagree with the fact that there could be a new alignment, you know, a kind of the different words for different scenario. Because it is complicated and it's complex. And I do think that people, even now, like, I guess talking with people here at the church, to use an example, there's different viewpoints about Biden. One person voted for Biden because he was better than Trump. Another person wants Trump. But still, when Biden won the presidency, she was like, Trump push too much, or Trump was too much. And I thought that was like an interesting kind of pullback. Although even now, she would be like, Trump is my guy. Trump is like, you know what I'm saying? So, but then there's that, but then there's still like, well, the question about, I mean, the 30-year-olds or people who have been alive since the fall of the Soviet Union until now, which are like 40s, 30s, and they're like, okay, well, this thing with Ukraine is like a world-changing event, and in a way, if you haven't been looking at history, it kind of is. But then the question of multipolarity asks, well, what is possible? Like we're already saying, Jeremiah, like what is actually going to emerge, and is that neither like in a binary sense, good or bad, but what can happen? What is what are the possibilities of that?
You know, the Grapes of Wrath and the other book, The Heart of Darkness, both of those kind of lenses is in my mind. The Grapes of Wrath, because I grew up in Philadelphia, but it's kind of like I was in the rural part. Even if they didn't want to designate West of Wayne or Upper Germantown as a rural area, but truly, if I had my camera back then, and you would say, wow, it was a complete rural-looking area with to paint a picture of it, orchards and people, grapes and things that was in Philadelphia that was grown in the 1800s, apple trees, pear trees, peach trees lined up down 20th Street, and all these blocks that I used to eat apples everywhere I went. Anyway, just the way how the city was looking, you know, for people to learn about where they were at, and it's something that Trump is the Grapes of Wrath in my mind. Is he could go and do just like doing in Russia. He could return back with a different information way of thinking about the world, because some things wasn't true when he was running, but some things is very true. And when the world's getting pushed into these types of wars where it's just the violence, it ain't even nothing gonna be made out of it. It's just the violence that this country enjoys, seeing people homeless. And they used to seeing people homeless. You go through Pennsylvania, and we probably say, "Oh my God, I didn't know Pennsylvania had felt like," because we don't take the lens and go through all these counties. They're not Philadelphia, but you can go through these different counties and say, "Oh my God," you say Fishtown, you say Allegheny. I say, no, this is what they want the people condition to look like. They want it to be like West Virginia. They want the people to feel like, we ain't even thinking about y'all. We didn't have no health care, so what? It's on you. It's not about how we plan what we doing in here. It's just do anything you like. But Trump could come. I'm not saying some visiting angel or some on spectrum, but at least I know somebody is not saying the same thing that everybody else is repeating.
That's true. That's true.
And if he comes out of his cocoon, like most people do, they wake up. I'm not saying he just wake up, but people could come out of the cocoon so something can transform you. You know, because you thinking things is going. I don't think things going to remain just as one view.
But what I was saying basically is that I think, well, if you want to talk about people or black people or whatever, I think it's like it still feels. If I were to have the gall to say. I don't know.
Say it.
No, it's like it feels like black people are still kind of like waiting a bit. There is
You
no
said they're- you said they're waiting.
still, you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Because even when I was hearing the day like 6 a.m., you know, like some I don't know who bombed who first. I don't really want to get into that right now, but it was like I was at the church, and this is what I felt. I could be perceiving this wrong,
Mhm.
but it just felt like, well, you know, okay, well, war is just on like, you know, the top of the list of all the other things that have been going on
Yeah.
around, and it felt not like, well, this is the moment where it's something else, but it felt like this is like like it's like making a situation bad, but the situation has already been bad.
Yeah.
That's what it felt like, and I'm just saying that because I have a feeling that, and I don't know, this is just based off of the conversation that we're having, and you know, kind of what I've been thinking about this week. Just that it's not gonna be like a straight shot.
No,
Basically, that's basically what I'm trying to say. But I don't.
I agree with you. It's not going. Let me let
I'm
Emil
sorry.
comment. No, that's. I mean, I was just agreeing. Go ahead.
Okay.
Emil.
Yeah, I mean, this idea that keeps coming to me is this ability to articulate and communicate with the broad masses of people.
Mm-hmm.
Try to understand where they're coming from and why someone like Trump is appealing. Now, from my own perspective, I can understand why he's unappealing. I have plenty of reasons for that. Plenty of contradictions within him as a leading figure. When he says, like you were saying, Magna, that we want to bring jobs back, he's at least speaking to the language of working people.
Yeah.
Working people don't want a handout. They want to work with dignity. They want a hard-working job so they can make a meaning out of their life, really.
That's true.
And so much of what's become, the trend in the liberal established, and I guess you could say the left, although again, I use that terminology, but like, is the idea is we can all get handouts. We'll all just like get handouts, and we'll all get better. We'll all get health care. We'll get income, just sent right to our doorstep.
Amazon.
And it's like, well, working people hear that in this country and understand, well, what does a handout mean to a working person? A bread line? Is that what you're talking about? Because most people who can understand that history recognize it means it's associated with poverty, deep poverty,
Yeah.
right? The handouts for the rich people are a totally different story, obviously.
Right.
But, so listening to the words and how they might be received by other working people is very, very important to trying to have some kind of unity. We need to understand each other.
Yeah.
That's true.
Can I just jump right on that?
Oh,
Which
go
is that
ahead.
Trump, had the more optimistic line.
Yeah.
Meaning, that's why I was asking earlier, would socialism be more receptive when people have jobs? Because they're like, oh, we run the factories already. We can organize our lives.
Mhm.
Whereas, I feel like what has called itself left or socialist has actually adapted to the neoliberal era. That there aren't going to be jobs, and so
Yeah.
the best that we can do is
Yeah.
get UBI or something like that.
Get used
Or
to
you-
not working
Yeah.
and taking
Yeah.
whatever we give you.
I don't like that
And
lifestyle.
besides the fact that we have an insane amount of need for infrastructure in this country, right?
Yeah.
I mean, who doesn't want to grow up and tell their grandkid, like, look, see this dam, I built this for you, you know?
Yeah.
Why don't we have that kind of thing?
True.
When you're going to tell your kid, you look down the street and see the state of most parts of the city and say, this terrible situation's for you, Like, I mean,
Something.
even my neighborhood I live in, all my neighbors talk about leaving. That's all they talk about. It's just like, oh, I can't, we had like 8 or 9 shootings in the last 2 weeks alone.
Oh
It's insane.
God.
Yeah.
Right down my street. Woman got shot, dropped her kid off to the daycare center. The bottom of my street.
Damn.
know,
Heard about
The next week, 2 guys got shot right outside the church, 2 blocks away from me. I was going to see last week, the new Ethiopian place, 3 blocks from there. 4 people got shot in the Rite Aid. Like, it's unbelievable.
Or they want to sell homes, or they're like getting. Or that's what the
I
conversation.
mean, yes.
No. That's around here. People are like, oh, they're coming to me.
Yeah,
They're trying to get me to sell my home.
yeah,
My aunt doesn't want to sell her home, or this, that, and the third.
yeah.
But another thing is like, even in this city, there is money.
Yeah.
It's in the hands
Oh, yeah.
of
Well,
Comcast or whomever,
that's the other,
And-
yeah. go ahead.
Penn
Yeah.
and all that. But in contrast, those big schools like Germantown High or whatever, Dobbins. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not
Oh,
like
yeah. And
money can't be put
Well,
in
that's
these
the other-
ways too.
The other half of the story is right on the other side of my street, the next block over. saw them being sold for $550,000.
No.
right now.
God.
The other side of my block. You know, and the Boys and Girls Club, which I grew up going to, they had all these programs for kids, sports, music, acting, computers, everything. It's being remade in the name of, I'm forgetting the Comcast CEO's father's name, something Roberts. They put a big plaque of his name over the building. They're going to save the building. Fortunately, they wanted to tear it down, make it into a hockey rink, and we stopped them doing that.
Oh, really?
But they've taken the ball fields, and there was 3 different public access points to the ball fields, and they've destroyed all of them.
Really?
Yeah.
Mm.
So you can only access it through the building, which I'm sure is not going to be totally
Not
open
at
to
all.
the public.
Not at all. Yeah, I guess a part of this situation is combating, like, you know, delinquency and, like, moral degradation.
Yeah.
Total
Yeah.
moral degradation. But I tell this woman that we're not feeding.
Yeah,
But, yeah, that has
Go.
already happened.
Oh, go on, I'm sorry.
Yeah, we just want the means to run our own lives. That's it. We're not asking for much. You know?
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I was thinking, I was just talking to Sophie about this before, but the situation with credit, I think, is really a big part of this. You know, it's not just like money, like banks. Okay, but who should have the money? Who should be able to say, I want to take a loan to buy a house? I want to take a loan to send my child to college. And that's just not in the hands of the people anymore. I mean, it's there's this map that I just really want everybody to see it's by this reinvestment fund. It's just tucked away, you know, in the back pages, but of the percent of transactions that are cash based, not mortgage based. And this blows my mind. In so much of North Philadelphia and Southwest, over 75% of all transactions are cash based.
Now, what does that mean?
That means that you're not buying it to live in it. Someone is
Oh.
buying it to rent it, to own it, to whatever, tear it down.
Yeah.
Someone
Like
has
it's
the
just
resources to do that.
yeah. I mean that's insane. I mean we've gotten to a point where just anybody, like you have concentrations of people, or people with huge, small number of people with huge concentration of money,
Thank you.
and they're just completely destroying people's lives, livelihoods, wealth, stability. And it's just, how is this legal? And nobody's talking about it. And then you have the left saying affordable housing. Give me a break.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're part of the problem.
Senior people, because I guess we, you know, I'm just saying from representing them and paying money and trying to find try to find a new means. You only have the means that you have.
Yeah.
But it was already. I might say my retirement was exploited already.
Yeah.
And what you have in the bank, I was a homeowner, that was exploited because some of the things that you need, they're right on top of you to take the means right out your hands.
Right.
So your loans and your credit ratings, anything that you could get damaged with, especially your credit rating, and then you can't the things you want to do financially, you got to think in the financial world. If you say I'm not into capitalism, well, I'm sorry, you're gonna have to reconfigure how to think in this capitalistic world about having breakfast, lunch, dinner,
Right.
wash your clothes, pay electric, pay for all your things. This is some serious thinking that's been put on top of senior people that cannot manage sometimes where they're at, even if they're in a high-rise building that they only have partial income to even live in this place. They do not have no access to no available money, even if they say they're gonna give it to you.
Yeah.
It's just not the. So that's a lot of pressure on the older generation. I'm looking back at people at 65. I'm 70. I'm looking at people at 60, and they cannot do it because it takes all your energy out of you to manage this every month or every week to pay where you're at. And that keeps them somewhat out of this pool that we're in
Yeah.
to discuss this. But it don't mean that they're dead, like they don't know what they were thinking about.
Yeah.
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 It does not mean that to me.
Definitely.
You know
That's
what I mean?
yeah.
You know, and this whole idea of I'm a socialist without the working class.
Yeah.
Well, that's a very interesting thing.
Well, that's why they try to ruin Spotify employees.
Is it organized with?
Spotify employees. University, like, adjuncts, whatever.
Yeah.
We don't really have a newsletter that we could probably have one page for what we're saying, because no one is going to be hardly discussing it. It needs to be on the topic, but they already is overwhelmed with just paper trash. Nothing that they really could, sometimes think of. And I'm a person that get bills, and I'm still in that world like that, so I understand. Do I got a minute to read? Yes, I do. I had to build that minute to read because the overwhelming flood this week, because it's a mishap. They want everybody to be in the mishap. It's not because what's going on in Russia. It's what's going to happen to you personally, your personal finance, or things that you go out and buy some gas. To find gas for your car, or find the money to pay for. All of those are fundamental things. These are real things that are affecting people, how you think and reason every day. So do they have time to do Hegel? We have to take everything out the bottle, because they can't be bottled back up. Somebody say Trump is back, they'll be like, so what is he saying? Because somebody want to have something, somebody got to say something that makes some opposing, some kind of resistance. Otherwise it'll just be like, how much dope is everybody on? and that's one of the major things affecting most of the population in Pennsylvania. I'm just using Pennsylvania as an example right now. And somebody say they're on drugs, or they're on morphine, or on something. Well, then how much dope are they on? Because you can't function like that.
Yeah.
How many prescription drugs do elderly people get? How much is it really needed, and how much is it not needed? So it's a lot of things at this table that in Russia or China, because they have very aged population, they could talk about this. Because someone got to take care of other people, because everybody can't just be a loaf. Like, we're not worried about that generation.
Awesome.
Let me see if there's some chat, some people,
Yeah.
and then.
Daryl Waistline Mitchell says, "Get a job was Philly. Got a job was Detroit. Smokey Robinson's Miracle." And he says, "Yep, Detroit in the house." I think that you're talking about UAW.
Okay. Who's that, Waistline?
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't know that Got a Job was Detroit.
Yeah, apparently it's by Smokey Robinson's The Miracles.
Oh, yeah, that was Smoke. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Got a Job.
Yeah, misrepresenting. Blaze, this is for Megna. Blaze says, another relevant and maddening infographic on property acquisition in Philly you might find interesting. It's from the Washington Post article that shows that, like, in the lowest income areas of Philadelphia, I think across the board cities, that's where most of the investment is going, or the fastest house purchases are. Yvonne says, the ideological struggle today is incredibly more difficult than 60 years ago, when organizations on the left had clear programs, whether you agreed with all of them or not, structures that incorporated accountability, evidence of some relationship with the masses, and were wary of certain funding sources. Whereas today, one doesn't know whether organizations are authentic, even if there are programs on their websites. What is the motivation of those programs? And today, the nonprofit industrial complex controls the funding of the left. So in whose interests do they actually serve? And then Jahan says, the West is failing to isolate Russia. The day of the military operations, the Prime Minister of Pakistan was visiting Moscow, interestingly to discuss a Pakistan-Russia pipeline to run through Central Asia. Right before that, the president of Azerbaijan, for what it's worth, the current chair of NAM, the non-aligned movement, was in Russia to sign a partnership agreement with Russia. Most major nations in Asia refuse to condemn Russia. The West and its clients are isolated. Helen says, layers of the ruling class do buy into the official narrative, but the top 0.01% know they are arming Nazis, and they knew it in the 1930s and 40s too. She says, economic hitmen influence third world nations. Helen's a poet. But Blaze also says, in response to Jahan's comment about the West failing to isolate Russia, he says, especially interesting to see China's response. United with Russia in condemning the expansion of NATO, and the West's threat to Russia, advocating Russian negotiation with Ukraine. Quote, "The parties oppose the further expansion of NATO, call on the North Atlantic Alliance to abandon the ideologized approaches of the Cold War, respect the sovereignty, security, and interests of other countries, the diversity of their civilizational and cultural historical patterns, and treat the peaceful development of other states objectively and fairly." And that's a quote from China's response. Yeah, this is back to black and white, unite and fight, but I know it might seem random, but there's this new TV show on ABC called Abbott Elementary, which like has a lot of hype, but it actually is like one of the most popular shows, and I've watched it, and I actually think it's really good. The creator's from West Philadelphia, and her mother was a school teacher, and it kind of, I feel like even Magna was like, I don't want to watch it because I'm just gonna be disappointed, but you watch it and it's actually very very smart, and it shows the two, like, there are two older teachers in this elementary school. One is a white woman from South Philly, and the other is a black Christian woman, and the two of them are seen as like kind of like the elders of the show, but they're like best friends. And Magna was making a joke where she was like, you know, that woman, that character from South Philly, she definitely voted for Trump. But it's like, I feel like it's for the, I mean, we've talked about culture in this country and like how you can't, you still go back to the music of the 60s because music today it's not the same, it doesn't resonate, it's not conscious. But I feel like in the TV show, there was a lot of contradictions like coming up that I didn't expect from the show, like showing that it's the black teacher and the white teacher, like older, who are the ones who have to mentor the younger teachers. You know, the Penn student, the teachers of Teach for America, like Jewish kid who like reads Cornell West and how to be an anti-racist and stuff, and has to, like, thinks that he knows things, but instead the teachers try to like educate him or like show him the real history of Philly. I just bring it up because also I was watching the Philly Pops, and well, Doe and I went to the Philly Pops and to see Motown, but there was an usher who turned out to be the president of the union there, and he was talking about, he was like, yeah, your generation, you guys have a hard job, and he was like, I don't mean to be Debbie Downer at halftime, but like there's a reason why to this day this orchestra has to play music from the 60s. He's like, the fact that he was like, I just get disappointed all the time because this country was supposed to go up and up and up from the 60s, but it's just gone down and down and down. And he was like, why is it that we still look to the visionaries and the music of back in the day? He's like, and you know, he's talking to someone who like grew up in the 60s, just like you, Doc, and you expect your whole life that things go up and up and up, but instead it just goes down and down and down. And he also, like, it's funny because he like also said something similar to you, Doc, where he was like, he was surprised that we knew about the Delphonics, which of course we only know from you, but he was really shocked. He was really like happy. But it's kind of that history where we were saying about how you could be so proud of the people walking the street being union workers. The music that people produce, not just like produce in terms of labor, but also like the music, the culture. And he was saying, he was like, did you know down the street it's Philly International? And I was like, what's that? And he was like, you don't know, you know the Delphonics, but you don't know Philadelphia International? And he was like, it's not, they rebuilt, he was like, the building's gone, but right down the street is where they made all the music. Delphonics, all of that. And yeah, it just reminded me of something you also said, Doc, earlier, where you were like, if the memory still lives, there's hope. Like, you know, that memory, and it's also related to Abbott Elementary, the show, which I actually do like, and I think people should watch it, but just the fact that I'm pretty sure the creator, the reason why the show is so popular in terms of numbers, but also I think is actually pretty smart comedically and like shows the different contradictions of society, like, you know, the West Philly anarchist who thinks like she knows things but actually doesn't, and like the futility of a lot of the protests that people do, things like, oh, we need to support raising the minimum wage for transit workers, but you hop over the turnstile to protest, but isn't that like preventing people from making money, like transit workers from making money off the transit system? Yeah, just poking fun at some of those contradictions. And like, I think in some ways the reason why, it just reminded me of that comment you made, Doc, about the memory, because I think for as long as there's a memory, like there's hope. But yeah.
that's so, and what you're just saying, because this, I mean, Serafina just brought it up a little while ago. I don't know if everybody got it, but, you know, this is a discussion she and I have been having for some time about, sometimes I think that black folk have done so much, given so much, that sometimes we say, do we have much more to give? I don't know. You can be exhausted by the struggle, and then the ruling class is the other thing, and I think Derek will agree with me here. The ruling class was not all that involved in our lives the way they are today. You know, in other words, if you see a black person on television, you know they've sold out and they've been chosen by the network, by the ruling class. You know, professional sports with the emphasis upon profession, professional, and money making, and it distorts the whole thing. I'm a boxing fan. Philadelphia's a boxing city. You know, we produce some of the great boxers. But one of the things about back in the days, you know, our great prize fighters, they trained early in the morning and went to work. They worked on jobs and lived in the community. You talk about Philly International, and you talk about the Delphonics, and all of that music. Of course, Teddy Pendergrass, Harold Monroe, you know, all of that. And that's nothing, I mean, it is something, but it's not, I mean, what Motown produced, Motown is the most working class city in America. Motown from Motor Town. That's where it comes from. That's right. And all of those groups, all of those singers were either in the auto plants at one time or had family members in the auto plants. Stevie Wonder, his family comes out of auto. You know, the Jackson 5 come out of Gary, Indiana, the steel town. You know, you can't grow up in Gary, Indiana. There's only one thing going on there, steel production. This was the working class. And therefore, it's so interesting. There were boundaries.
Yes.
And they were set by the community. Yeah, you could violate it. Yeah, you could be a bully, a punk, you know, whatever. But everybody ain't doing that. Everybody, you know, there were young, I mean, when you were interested in music, or you thought you could be a singer or a guitar musician, you know, you were thinking in a certain way related to how you were socialized. The ruling class has gotten involved in I'm talking about black people's lives in ways they never were. You see the Uptown Theater? I wish you guys could have, I wish it was like it used to be. Black entertainers from Smokey Robinson, Stevie Wonder, Supremes, Harold Melvin, whoever, they all came there. And if you got there early enough, you could go in for 50 cents or $1, I forget, and you just stay all day and into the night, and you would see something of beyond. But you know, it's that thing of we were segregated. We had our black colleges. You know what I'm saying? We had our black churches. You know, we now seem to be integrated and ain't got nothing. The music ain't right. You know, the athletes ain't right. Yeah, they can jump higher than ever before.
Be taller and bigger.
And they, oh God, are they taller? You know? But what about the soul? What about the values?
Yes.
You know, you don't have a Muhammad Ali. And so we have to, just like um, to Hegel, just like Frederick Engels. I was talking to Nora yesterday about this. You know, Engels, I feel, wrote better when he was in his late 20s and early 30s. I thought his writing was far better. And he was writing against those who were trying to bury Hegel.
Nice.
And you don't have Marxism without the fight for the legacy of Hegel. You don't have it. And he was this, and so for us today, to fight for that great moment, the values, the achievements, the art of that great revolutionary moment is a condition of going forward. We cannot go forward. Is this, y'all got to tell me. You have to have, look, if you choose Mary J. Blige over Aretha Franklin, you got to be re-educated. You don't know what you're talking about. If you don't understand the significance of, let us say, James Brown and funk, what emerges out of him, and just anything today is the equivalent of that, I don't think so. I really don't think so. And that's not even getting to the greatest achievement, and that is jazz. Train, Cecil Taylor, names that a lot of people don't know in this country. You go to Japan, they know them. Why was it shut down? It's just like I always ask the question, why aren't young people taught the great philosophers like Kant and Hegel?
Right.
Why is American pragmatism seen as the equivalent of that? There's a reason. All of this is politics.
It is.
And I think, the spiritual life world of the working class is as important
It is.
as the economic conditions.
Yeah.
Without the values of the working class, you can't move forward. It's going to be self-defeating.
And
Go ahead.
no, that's kind of like to your question about, well, do we need jobs or do we not need jobs to have socialism?
No, I said the working class.
No, I know. I was thinking about his question.
Oh,
remember?
I'm sorry.
No.
I'm sorry.
My bad. But yeah, Daniel had said, like, was it more possible to have socialism when there was a more stable working class and things like that? You remember? But yeah, a part of that is what you're saying, Doc, in the moral, having morality and having a different foundation, spiritual life world of the people. And with that, I think you can do a lot of things. I think you won't be able to do everything. Like Derek was already saying, you might not be able to pay for everything, but at least you have a standard for how you're to act and behave. But that's more clarifying to me.
Yeah.
They're mutual, right? In other
I
words,
think
the
they're
spiritual
mutual.
power was part of
Yeah.
also the economic strength of the working
Absolutely.
class.
I mean, that helps build it,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's why, you get with Robeson singing the songs of the working people.
Yeah.
Singing the songs of the working people. And, that was a manifestation of his consciousness.
It's almost two.
Well, y'all, it's almost 2, and so I guess we have to end.
We talk about the black church, and it more than meet the eye sometimes because we investigating something, and I'm saying from feeling wise, I visit church have belonged to a church, not because I'm following something, but it's the form of what the church has brought some of our attitudes and our work, and just certain things that people interacted with each other in the church and out the church, but they interacted in business and finance. A lot of things that, you know, except with my grandmother, she used to keep a little book. She knew what she had. She you know what I mean, like that. But she still, I was being winemakers in 1950 something. And she said, meet me at winemakers at the evening. I'd be like, oh, they going, and I would be at winemakers downtown, you know, waiting for my grandmother. But she was operating like how she presented herself too, you know, like that. But we gotta take.
No, we do
We
need
gotta take hold of some of these things.
a great cultural revolution, reclaiming of the great music, reclaiming of art as part of the people reclaiming themselves.
True that. True that.
And it can be done, but it has to be done. And I guess we'll end on this. I think Serafina said it, that great events, great changes in the world have a way of filtering into the life of all nations. And I think that is possible here, especially here.
Yes.
Because I think, you know, the unintended consequence of what is happening will be negative for the American ruling class. And I just think it's going to make it more difficult for the Democrats. Definitely they're losing the House and the Senate, and I don't see how they can win the presidency in 2024. And can I just, one quick thing, the discussion of fascism quickly.
Oh, right.
You know, one of the arguments, the way this thing was presented, is that fascism is a government. No. Fascism is a form of state power of the ruling class. A fascist government is derivative of a fascist state form. I think we got to get this very clear. Cornell made every huge mistake in the world in his formulation about this. But to understand fascism is to understand it in terms of the state, a state form. Therefore, last point, you could have what appears to be a liberal government fronting for a fascist state form. I'll just stop there.
Well, wasn't that Du Bois's point when he talked about Nazism?
Yeah.
It was like actually Hitler had very socialistic policies.
Oh, there's no question.
But it was a fascist.
That's right.
Fascist,
That's right.
maybe
That's right.
fascist.
That's right. And he said that Nazis were trying to imitate the Soviet Union.
They had to,
They had to.
right? Because they were appealing to former socialists.
That's right. That's right. They had. That's right. Okay, folks. It's been real. It's been realer than real.
Thanks, Doc.
Thanks, Doc.
I felt like it.
You're really emotional about this stuff.
I am.
Calm
No,
down,
never
girl.
that. Never that.
I'll try to call you sometime.
Oh yeah, call me.
Did you see that? I tried to find the ticket for you. Does that one work? I didn't send you.
But I'll call you if I have any questions. Okay, all right.
You have to teach me. I'm trying to learn more.
Are you going? You know how class that, like, I don't know, some people just like, oh, you lost weight. And the real reason is because I've not been reading Nathan Rogers' book. I'm going to, you're going to make me return to my former glory.
100%.
But I also really appreciate the thought.
But I will message you one time.
No, I was getting very
Not too much. You come for dinner. Pretty much. Yeah. Let's do that. Okay, that sounds really good, honestly. We haven't talked about